So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Overview and Scrutiny Committee. My name is Marie-Therese Rossi. I am the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and this meeting is being held in accordance with the latest government guidelines about having remote meetings and not being able to gather together and to stay at home. It's also being streamed live to members of the public and media, and people are I'm very happy for people to listen in to the meeting. And I would like to welcome any people who have come to the meeting for the first time. So I think it would be appropriate if we started this meeting with 72 seconds of silence for those who tragically lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So at the outset, I would like to ask members of the committee and other people in attendance to mute themselves and to turn off their camera unless they are called to speak. If our councillor wishes to speak and I haven't called them, please could you either type a Q in the chat column or raise a hand, or failing that, just speak out. If for any reason the connection drops, my connection drops during this meeting, I will hand over to my vice chair, Adrian Barrell-Cox, and failing that to Councillor Greg Hammond. Thank you. So firstly, I'm going to call on each member of the committee to make sure that they're here, and also to ask them if they have any declarations of interest. So firstly, I will call Adrian Barrell-Cox. Can you hear me now, Adrian? No, okay. Kazim Ali?
Yes, Madam Chair, yes, present and nothing to declare.
Councillor Max Chowan?
Yes, present and also nothing to declare.
Councillor Janet Evans?
Present, Chair, nothing to declare.
Councillor Gregory Hammond?
Here, ma'am, and nothing to declare.
Councillor David Lindsay?
Here, Madam Chairman, nothing to declare either.
Councillor Pat Mason?
Present and nothing to declare. Thank you.
And Councillor Will Pascal?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, and nothing to declare. Thank you.
So I have one apologies for lateness from Councillor Marwan El Nai. So hopefully he will join us later. And we don't have, we still don't have Adrian Barrell-Cox, but I think we will proceed while Tom tries to sort that out. I have the minutes in front of me of the meeting held on the 17th of December. Does everyone agree in the committee that I can sign these as an accurate record?
Agreed.
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 Thank you.
Agreed. Can we have an update, Chairman, on any matters arising?
Yes. What are you thinking of, Pat?
Well, I'm just thinking of the item that you commented on with regard to the Warrington Green trees.
We can take that now, or we can take it at the end in the work programme, whether my letter is part of the pack. I sent you a copy of the Castalis letter, and I am waiting to hear whether I'm allowed to disseminate that letter. But I will let people have it if I can. I hear that there has been some direct action, so perhaps you would like to talk about that.
Yes, I was going to. That's what I was going to update you on. On yesterday, the tree fellers arrived at 8 a.m. With the intention of cutting down the trees, but about at least 20 residents and more later turned up to exhort them not to do anything of the kind. The outcome was really that they decided yesterday not to actually cut the trees down, but to prune them. And they said to us that they would prune for the rest of the week and not cut them down. Of course, there was a lot of skepticism amongst the residents there, but today they continued pruning. So no one believes they won't cut them down eventually, but as of today, they haven't cut them down. And of course, the action, there may be more action. Well, there will be more action because people the ones that turned up were very passionate about the fact that they'd been to this scrutiny committee. Some of them quoted what you had said about the fact that you considered that Catalyst had not engaged sufficiently with residents, etc. Nobody listened to the scrutiny committee, they said. Nobody listened to residents. And one resident said some of those trees have been there since Queen Victoria was on the throne, and who are you to cut them down? So that's kind of what happened, and I think it could get more angry as the days go on. Okay,
so can I just say, Pat? Firstly, I apologise. I did try in the scrutiny meeting in December to ask Catalyst to think again and to try to save the trees, but they didn't listen. So recently I have been back twice to the planning department. So what I was trying to establish was if indeed the planning permission was live and, legal, what they were doing. And I have now asked for an answer to that in writing. But from what I can hear from the planning department is that it's what Catalyst said. They got the permission in 2010, and therefore they're not going to change what they're doing. So I'm very sorry about that, but I am pursuing it with the planning department, and I will contact the lead member again to see if there is anything that we can do.
Yeah. Anyway, that's where it's at, and we're led by what the residents do or say, and that's it. I will leave whatever happens action-wise to the residents, some of whom will be listening. But of course, as I said at the last meeting, Catalyst have always maintained that they have legal right. We know how they got that. I won't repeat what I said at the last meeting. They don't really care what we think. They want to rebuild their estate, and they don't care if they cut down 37 trees as it is now, that we all opposed 10 years ago and residents oppose now. So we will watch this space as
okay. And I won't say much more. Say, again, I'm very sorry that this is where we are, but and I'll come back to you when I get a written reply from the planning department. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
So moving on, this is the part of the meeting, the state of the borough, and I wanted to say something just before, because I know a lot of this is going to be about COVID. To say tonight we've passed the milestone of 100,000 deaths, and so I think the committee would like to, extend their condolences to all of those, in this country who have suffered as a result of COVID. And so I will now introduce the leader of the borough, Councillor Elizabeth Campbell, and also the Chief Executive, Dr. Barry Quirk. I don't know which would like to go first, but I think they're going to give us an update now.
Yes, thank you, Mary-Therese. I think what we're going to do is I'm going to just give a very brief introduction, and then Barry's going to go through a whole series of slides. So we do have a report which is 77 pages long, 77 slides, but we decided that actually we will publish that at the end of the week. And what that is, it's almost like an almanac of everything that's going on in the borough. It's got headline level data of all the overall characteristics of place, of population, the economy. It's got a huge amount of detail. And you can think of it really as a sort of a combination, as a sort of a socio-economic atlas combined, I suppose, with performance data. But given where we are, all that set of data, which gives you a really good look into what the long-term trends are in the borough, it doesn't give you a really dynamic look of what's happening now. And as you said, today we've just heard the Prime Minister say we've had 100,000 dead in this country. And I thought that actually the most important thing was to look at what the effect of the pandemic is here in Kensington and Chelsea, because that's the main thing that's facing us at the moment. And I suspect that's what the majority of the overview and scrutiny would like to ask questions. So really over to you, Barry, but just to say that the big report, it will be available at the end of the week. And it's a really useful report because it gives you all the data that anyone would ever want to know if you're framing evidence for things or looking at policy things. All the evidence is there, and I commend it to you.
Thank you very much indeed. If I could I'm just going to load something. If you be patient with me for a moment, I'll be with you. So it's taking a little while. Here we go. I have to say, in the last couple of days, I had some great difficulty in putting this presentation together, simply because I really couldn't believe the crisis that was happening in hospitals, and was looking at the numbers for London. And when one looks at these numbers, there's a tendency to become a sort of desiccated calculator and just adding up numbers. And when you realise that the impact this is having, that all of us, I suspect each of us knows grief from COVID, in how it's affected us in terms of family terms, and also friends and work colleagues and so on. And as the leader has said, the State of the Borough report, we will publish it later this week. It will be a sort of almanac, something for you to use really, about statistics about the borough and the trends, underlying trends in the borough. And as the leader has said, it covers the issues of place, population, economy. But I do think that we do need a shorter term picture about the impact that COVID has had, both on the mortality and health of our population, but also the havoc that it's wreaked on the economy of the nation of London, and particularly of Kensington and Chelsea. Could I have the next slide, please? I should be able to do this myself, but it seems to have disappeared. There you are. I've taken it back. Is there someone able to do the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Is that Tom? Are you able to push it forward?
Barry, can you see the London slide at the moment?
No, I can't.
We're currently on the London slides. We just went past the NHS slide.
Oh, I see. If you, I can't see those slides, unfortunately. Which
should we go back to the admissions?
Go back to the first page.
Yeah.
Yes, if you could, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, we're there. We're on the 100,000 death slide now.
Okay. All right. Well, it's difficult for me because I don't actually have the presentation in front of me.
I'm wondering what we could do if you could.
So look, if you have the 100,000, I've opened it separately, and if we go through this, it'll be helpful if someone could, if I say next slide, we'll go on. So if we're on the 100,000 slide, which is slide 2, then I'll move forward. So basically, in the last 47 weeks, since the early March, 100,000 people have died with a positive COVID test, and almost 21,000 of these have died in England's hospitals over the past 5 weeks. And in London's hospitals, a total of 4,381 have died, and that is really since Christmas week, and people all remember the dilemmas, the quandaries that people were discussing about family gatherings and so on at Christmas, and the warnings that were given by our public health colleagues about the challenge that will be faced by the NHS. And despite the incredible efforts of everyone, you can see on that chart on the right, the COVID-19 deaths in London hospitals over the past 5 weeks. And staggering that the most recent one was over 1,250. If we go to the next slide, please, which is the current picture of COVID-19 locally. And if you're on that slide, then what you'll see is a schematic map of London, with Kensington and Chelsea being marked in green, with a case rate, infection rate per 100,000 people of 339.5. And we are, as you can see, along with Richmond upon Thames and the city, in the lowest areas. And of course, we were just a couple of weeks ago at a much higher level of infection rate. And indeed, the average in London at the time was over 1,000, but that has come down. So what we can see from this is a picture where death rates in hospitals are going up at the same time that the infection rates in the community is dropping slightly. And it's a significant drop at that. So we, at least we feel that our public health colleagues feel that we've gone from plateauing to declining in terms of the case rates. Nonetheless, these case rates, even these case rates at 339, are substantially higher than the ones we were looking at 3 or 4 months ago, when we were concerned about moves from 20 cases per 100,000 to 50. We shouldn't become inured to these numbers. Next slide, please. This is the daily public health intelligence update as of today's date, and this shows the rates in relation to Kensington and Chelsea. Westminster's are slightly higher than ours. London, which as you can see is at 558.7. It also shows the positivity testing and 7-day case rate. And it might be helpful if my colleague Natalia Clifford is able to outline, give some flesh to what these numbers are about, to put them in their context.
So, hi everyone, good evening. Absolutely. So, as Barry said, there is some good news there with we're seeing the decline. And if you can look at the bottom graph, you can see from that 7th of January, we were going very firmly upward until we hit into lockdown. And you know, you can see the effects of lockdown, as difficult as it is for everybody. These restrictive measures are making a huge impact on the case rates per 100,000. What I would like to say, sorry, I was like what I would like to say is if you do look at the 7-day case rate per 100,000 in the 60 plus, it's not coming down actually as fast as it is in the total population. And of course, it's the 60 plus population which unfortunately does convert into the hospital admissions and sadly into our deaths. So we're looking really, really closely at that 60 plus population and keeping a really firm eye on it. And I think just in terms of that future position, Barry, I think, you know, we can imagine that we'll still need to be in restrictive measures for a while until we see a real reduction in that. What I just wanted to say was that obviously Kensington and Chelsea today is at 339.5 per 100,000. And you're comparing that to London and England, it's that top graph. We're now starting to get more comparable. So London was way out of whack with England until very recently, having much higher rates. And now we can see that we're starting to be comparable with, so London's at 558 more or less per 100,000 and England's at 420. We're starting to close that gap as we all start to decline. Finally, the positivity rates just fine. Sorry, is that we're also seeing a decline there, which is great. So looking at lower transmission in the community. Thanks.
Natalia, thank you very much. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This just says the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic so far. And I'm trying to highlight here the impact of that pandemic on London in particular and on Kensington and Chelsea in both health terms, but also in economic terms. So the next slide, please, which says COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit likely to have a negative impact on the population of the borough. I think there is a major question about whether London was stalling before the COVID hit. In 2019, London's population growth, so this was before the pandemic, was just 0.5%, which was the lowest population growth London had experienced, really, certainly in the last 20 years. And that population growth is made up of a number of things. One is the net migration internationally, and internationally, 192,000 people came into London and 119,000 people left. So broadly, about 73,000 or so additional population as a result of net international migration. But an important issue that's been noted in the last 5 years, and particularly arising from London's high housing costs, has been the net position relative to the rest of the UK. So 255,000 people have come into London from the rest of the UK in that year, but 349,000 people left, which meant that there was a 94,000 loss to the rest of the UK. And really, that also with a natural change in terms of births over the death rate in 2019, meant that the population of London was really very flat. And yet all of our policies, and all of London's policies, all the GLA's policies, all of government's policies are based on this sort of inexorable growth in London's population, and therefore also in its economy, and its demand on housing, and so on. And yet just before the pandemic, there was a sense that London was beginning to stall. And you'd have seen there's some coverage now about whether the population projections are now going to turn quite substantially. Estimates of 1.3 million people having left the UK in the last 5 months. And of those 1.3 million, half of them, or at least half of them, say 700,000, being from London. And obviously, and you can see in the graph at the bottom there on the left, how most of the change is down to net migration, not to population natural change. So the issue for us looking forward is, well, what is likely to be the net migration issues in relation to London and specifically to Kensington and Chelsea. Now, Kensington and Chelsea has the highest ratio of people with EU passports, 20%. That's the highest in London. We also have the highest, or rather the lowest number of lowest share of our population where people have UK passports. And both these passport indicators are, in a sense, showing to us that we could lose population. So although the current trends and the current forecast, which is based really on what was happening in 2018 and 19, if we were to roll it forward, the population that we're looking at, 155 to 160, with this estimate that our population may go up really, or stay the same, and London's population will go up by 4%, that's now, I think, quite fragile, a foundation for that estimate. And it's likely, I think, that population may stall in London, if not decline substantially. People are saying possibly declining by 5% plus for the next year or so. And that, I think, would mean that our population may decline by, well, certainly as high as 10,000. And that all of these things have bearings, not just on the vibrancy of the place and the people that are here, but actually also on the resources that's commanded by the authority. Could you do the next slide, please? Now, this slide shows that the borough's two main industries have been heavily impacted by successive lockdowns. Retail is the main industry in the borough, and it employs 15.5% of the people. And accommodation and food is the second most, and employs just slightly less than that, 14.8%. So we've effectively got 30%, or nearing a third, nearing 1 in 3 of the people working in the borough in the retail and accommodation and food service sectors. And as you can see there, this is the impact that essentially these are the shutdown sectors really in the 2 successive lockdowns. And therefore people that work locally, and especially people who live locally and work locally, are really affected by this lockdown and really affected despite lots of the job support measures that have been put in place. Let me just go to the next slide now. And this says that 10% of employees in RBKC were furloughed for 6 months during the pandemic. And you'll know that that furlough scheme is continuing. But this job retention scheme, which is absolutely novel and absolutely targeted, the take-up rate for it is matches the London average, and the claims are principally in these retail and accommodation areas. So we know that workers locally, many of them are furloughed, and it's very difficult to work through what is the likely impact of that on employment going forward. How much of people will return to work? It's very likely that the businesses concerned won't know, let alone the workforce. And therefore, we're living at a time of chronic economic uncertainty and financial insecurity, therefore, not just for the workers, but for the business owners as well. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is universal credit claimants in Kensington and Chelsea, and how these have increased and where they've increased. And on the right is the map of Kensington and Chelsea by the local super output areas, there's probably around about 5 or 6 of these for each ward in the borough. They're not nested within wards, they overlap the ward boundaries. But at the local super output area, a lot of these maps of index of multiple deprivation across London, they tend to be maps of where the deprivation tends to reflect, certainly in inner London, social housing and private rented housing. In Kensington and Chelsea, it more reflects social housing, housing that the authority owns, as well as housing owned by registered providers and housing associations. But you'll see that if you look at the first map on the left, yes, there's a distribution there that's not surprising, from in the Riverside area up through Earls Court, and then of course in North Kensington, and then that concentration that's come with this increase, this 120% increase, this concentration in the north of the borough, but also in the Earls Court area, as well as on Riverside. And there's many people who've been claiming universal credit and are claiming it for the first time. Some people have been shifted to universal credit, but some people have made applications for universal credit, and they've really not had a history of making employment claims. And what we're seeing is great variety within groups of people that are claiming universal credit. If I can move to the next slide, please. 12% of people, so about 1 in 8 of all residents who are claiming, are young 16 to 24-year-olds. And this graph on the left, where it was in June 2019, 390 or so claimants of 16 to 24-year-olds, and we find that there's 1,300 or thereabouts now. So we're gaining about 1,000 additional young people who are claiming universal credit between the ages of 16 and 24. And this is the local evidence, really, of that general pattern that we've seen both nationally and in London, which is the impact, particularly in the sectors, the shutdown sectors, the particular impact on young people, on people of ethnic minority, Black, Asian and other minority background, of women in employment as well. So we're seeing that although it's often talked about its impact on everyone, yes, but it doesn't impact on everyone in the same way, at the same rate. There are disparities in how this is affecting people in health terms, as well as how it's affecting people in economic terms, in terms of the economic consequence. Just a few things now. The next slide speaks to homelessness locally, and particularly the extreme form, which is rough sleeping. Now, we were given responsibilities as an authority to, as were all authorities, to deal with the issue of rough sleeping. And over the lockdown, we were able to house all of the 120 rough sleepers that are accommodated. And at the same time, I think the charts there shows our success in the 2 areas of the new Homelessness Reduction Act, which is in homelessness prevention and homelessness relief. This information will be, obviously all the information here is going to be available to members, will be circulated alongside the broader almanac of data. Next slide, please. There's a couple of silver linings in this. One is that crime levels have dropped, although we shouldn't be overly emphasizing how good this is, because one of the reasons why the crime levels has dropped is because the shops are closed for a good deal of the period, and 20% of all theft locally is shoplifting, and therefore that will have an impact. So the crime levels, given the fact that shops are closed, given the fact that people aren't on the streets to the same level that they were, then actually it's almost impossible to compare this period to a previous period. But if you look at the crime prevalence in 2020, it's good that there's a drop in violence against the person by 7%. That is a significant drop. For London, it's just 1%, and for inner London, it's 5%. And it's good that there's just one homicide. I mean, be it that one homicide is one homicide too many, but that's significant, that's less than the 5 homicides that precede it. So we've had a drop in violence as a result of lockdown, people being locked in their homes, or violence against the person in the public realm. Of course, we're very acute and alert to the issues of whether there's been violence within homes, not just violence in the public realm. There's also, of course, been a drop in drug offences, whereas interestingly, in the rest of London, there's been an increase. So you can see the comparisons there between Kensington, Chelsea, and inner London and the rest of London. If I can go to the next slide, please. This really talks about the most transport planners' dream to achieve modal shift. That's the policy instrument or the policy outcome that they want to achieve, is people changing their pattern of movement. The issue, as you can see from this, is there's not been much movement. that actually what we've seen in the purple line on the left, that is the movement of people residentially in their areas. And across London, people are moving in their locality now, as they've always done. Perhaps they may even be doing more movements locally. And it's being said that local centres in outer London are actually benefiting economically, whereas central London retail centres are losing. The green line is about the use of parks, and you can see that over the summer months in particular, and as we notice in a moment, the use of our parks really went up, and these are parks across London. So a very significant thing about recreation, most of it obviously done locally. The blue line is the retail and recreation, which is, as you can see, at one point a 90% drop, and even now a 68 to 70% drop on what was the previous position in February last year. February the 6th is the baseline. And you can see the significant drop of commuting that has occurred, and the issues on the right there are about the proportion of people working from home. And the issue, I think, is whether these trends, whether there will be a rebound to a previous way of travelling and commuting and working, or whether there will be a rebound to something new, or whether these behaviour patterns are baked into our behaviour. Having people not commuting into London, working from home, buying things locally, principally filling up their communal areas or their halls at home with Amazon cardboard boxes or whatever. There's purchases of things online. Will that be baked into behaviour? Will people return to past patterns? It's likely that both of these things will be true. So we need to be thinking about the economy of central London, how we can support that. The next slide, please. This actually describes all the impacts on our services, really, and what just puts into one slide what the issues have become. So there's the beginning of the pandemic, this 40% workplace commuters reduction, retail and recreation saw that incredible decrease between 90 to 40%. The issue about parks, we saw a significant increase in the summer. We've noticed that buying of groceries and medicines and so on, that's really kept up. People, the idea of confinement and staying at home has really been the biggest issue, I think, for all of us, and has impacted on all of our lives in many ways. And of course, the issue then becomes about demand shocks for transportation and the extent to which this will roll forward into the future. I think I should say that, you know, this is the most astonishing year. We as an authority, I think, have acted brilliantly. The frontline staff, the communities themselves, working with VCS, what we're doing at the moment in relation to working with our voluntary community sector and communities themselves in trying to get ahead the message of the vaccine. And we may be talking and ask questions about that later, but literally discussing with people the way in which everyone has stepped up, councillors and officers, frontline workers, our suppliers and our partners, to try to make life as livable as is feasible in the constrained circumstances that we live in with COVID, to try to make this a livable place where people can move around safely, securely, and for their health to be maintained. The challenge that we have is looking forward. There is plainly light at the end of the tunnel because of the vaccine. The rollout of the vaccine is a logistical challenge, the like of which both the Army and the NHS have never seen before. We in local authorities stand ready to support with that vaccine rollout. And once we've gone through the first wave of this vaccine rollout, then I think we'll be through the restrictions. But those restrictions, as Natalia said earlier, will probably be with us for several weeks and months. Doubtless they'll be eased gradually in some areas, but we need, as we've discovered with all of our discussions in those middle weeks of December about should it be locked down or shouldn't it, we now know very, very clearly that we can't turn back the tide of this second wave, and we may not be able to turn back the tide of the third wave if we don't get the vaccine rollout done quickly. So we've learned our lessons, and we need to balance the caution with the confidence as an authority. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Barry, for giving us a very comprehensive overview. I've got just a couple of quick questions, which I don't know if you have any information on how our hospitals are doing. So in particular, Chelsea and Westminster, but also St Mary's and Charing Cross. Do you have information about how they're managing at the moment?
Talia, could you answer that?
Yes, I know that I think it might be better if we come back to the proper answer, if that's okay, Mary-Therese. I know that they are currently working in North West London as a sector, supporting each other in terms of not only staffing, but also in terms of bed utilisation. But I think that they are definitely at sort of capacity. But if I could get back to you on actual numbers later on, if that's okay.
Yes, if I can reassure you that the chief executives across these 8 authorities, we meet weekly with our NHS colleagues. Our public health and operational connections meet at least 2 or 3 times a day, and we meet weekly in order to find out what is the next problem. The last issue we were looking at was the admission rates and the capacity of the hospitals, and they were working extremely well, I have to say, with our social care colleagues to try to keep below capacity. We're currently looking at the issue of vaccine supply to make sure that our part of that London generally, in our part of London, gets adequate and gets the rollout as quick as possible. I don't know if Elizabeth may have had conversations about the hospital.
I was just going to say, I think quite a lot of our role is supporting the NHS. So you're absolutely right. You know, the hospitals are almost at capacity. And what they haven't had this time is they haven't had a through flow, which is a good thing because the mortality rates actually have been less this time round. But it does mean there are lots more people who are very ill, who need spaces in hospitals. So really our job's been to try and see so that if the NHS say to us, if they can just reduce everyone's stay by half a day because they can discharge them into the community, that makes an enormous difference. So we've been working incredibly closely with the NHS to make sure that when it comes to hospital discharge, and that we can get people home, they can be looked after at home safely. That's been very important.
Thank you. I'll now call on Councillor Hammond.
Thanks very much, Chair, and Barry, thanks very much for your necessarily sobering presentation this evening. Can I start where you finished, which is on vaccination? And I appreciate that's a matter for the NHS, but do you have a feel for how that's going locally as a comparison with the rest of London, with our neighbours, with the rest of England? So how are we doing locally? That's the first question. And then testing, I know we, when we started the lateral flow tests in the autumn, very great success in how it started, but how's that going? And finally, could you give us a feel for how this second wave is going in our care homes, please?
I can come on back.
Yeah,
sorry.
okay, certainly.
Shall I come in on vaccines and testing,
Yes,
Barry?
please do.
So thank you so much for that question. Yeah. So in terms of vaccines, yes, we're doing very well compared. We're absolutely on track. I just actually came off from a call this morning with North West London. So we're on track to meet the deadline of the 4 priority groups being vaccinated by the middle of February. And in terms of supporting that, and all of our care homes have been visited, and all of our over 80s, I think, have been offered a vaccine, and certainly meeting that 80% target. So that's absolutely fantastic news. Our mass vaccines centre will be the Science Museum, and that should be coming online the 3rd or the 4th next week. So we'll get final comms on that. But that's just really fantastic news for us in terms of the borough. It's a great location, it's got great access, great disability access. So that'll be great. There is, of course, lots of what we can continue to do in terms of supporting local authority, really leaning in terms of our support in terms of highway signage, marshals, all that sort of stuff. So we're really working hand in glove with the NHS on that. In terms of testing, the LFTs, all our sites are open. We're still getting a lot of throughput there. We've opened up key worker slots, so open at 7:30 on a Monday and Wednesday for our construction workers and our early years teachers, and that's we're seeing a lot of activity there, and they're really very grateful that early slot is available to them. And we continue to work with schools as well, because of course they need to be doing their LFTs for those that are supporting key workers and vulnerable children. In terms of care homes, I think Gareth's on the call. If you want to comment on that, Gareth.
Happy to, yes, if that's okay with you, Barry.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Hammond. The care homes across the borough have received enhanced support during this wave of the virus. That includes an enhanced testing regime whereby staff are tested every week and residents have been tested every day. And where there has been an incident or outbreak of infection, staff are then tested every day using the lateral flow test before they start work. We've also been rolling out the government's mandated infection control fund to all of our care homes and distributing that on a monthly basis so that they're able to support staff to isolate at home if they need to, and bring in extra staff to cover that, to make sure they're covering their costs on PPE, etc. Sadly, as in the first wave, we have had some instances of residents passing away from COVID, either in hospital or in the home itself. And where outbreaks occur and the risk of that comes into place, we've had really strong collaborative working from both primary care colleagues who are linked to each of the homes and frailty nurses from the key hospital trusts in the area.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your answers. Could I just come back to Natalia with one supplementary, please? You said, I didn't write it down exactly, but the target, you were on track to meet the target of, I think it was 80% of over 80s having been offered a first vaccine.
Everyone is 100% offered already.
100%.
Yeah, 100% offered already. 80% to be attained.
So the take up is what then? So of those offered, how many are accepting and how many are refusing?
So we can share that data afterwards if that's okay, because it's at a North West London level and I can get that all to you. But we're currently, in terms of that at local borough level, we don't have that shareable data currently.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because obviously we want to encourage maximum take up, and I'm wondering if we've got a problem or not.
Definitely. Thank you so much for asking that question. Oh, when we're looking at reasons for refusal and all of that, but that might just be a separate item if that's okay.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for your answers and all the work that you and your team are doing.
Councillor Ali, you have a question.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I have a couple of questions. Just at the beginning, you've mentioned, in fact, Dr. Barry Quirk mentioned the death of Londoners, or the death of the whole country past 100,000. That is a huge number, and I follow with you my condolences to the families who've lost their loved ones, and hopefully we will get to the bottom of this pandemic and go through. But I would like to ask the leadership and the chief executive, what is of that number? Can you please tell us the specific number, the figure in RBKC? What is the death toll in RBKC? And at the same time, you've also mentioned about the population of London when you were giving your figures. I also would like to know the effect that the population of Kensington and Chelsea from 2019 Perhaps if we can find it up to now, if not from 2019, specifically similar information, but it's concentrating RBKC. And finally, to the leader of the borough, we've seen the depression, the problem of the deprivation of the south, that's Chelsea Riverside, Earls Court, and the north of the borough. What would be your economic plan for the hopefully recovering from COVID-19 and allowing those communities who have been hit hard and feeling they're left out after the COVID-19 we recover from them? What would be the situation you could do at least, if not for RBKC, but also push the government to help recover our communities in RBKC and hopefully have a better future after the COVID-19? Thank you.
Where do you want to start? Shall I start with what we're doing for our communities, and then Barry can go on to the other things? I think the first thing is one of the most important things that we've been doing is actually getting out the business grants that the government has given us and getting it out quickly and effectively. And if you think at the beginning of this, we didn't really have much of a database, whereas now we're managing to get out all the discretionary grants, all the other things to people as quickly as possible. So I think that's one thing. We've got to carry on helping our businesses because, you know, the business is employing so many, as Barry said, so many local people. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we've had a hardship fund of £500,000. So where people or businesses have slightly fallen through the cracks because they haven't quite hit the criteria, we've been able to look at those and say, well, okay, we can, you know, give you X amount of money or etc. So that's been a very useful thing we've done. I know with council rents, we've also, council tax, we have a very generous fund for people who can't afford to pay. I think we're one of the only councils in the country who've got that. And in addition, people who can't pay their rents, we've also been looking at their cases on an individual basis. So for businesses, for individuals, for those renting, for those paying tax, we've looked and helped a huge amount of people. So that's the first thing. The next thing is, I think your question holds really true. But what we need to do, as well as doing things that we're already doing, is ask people what they think would help them the most. So you'll see that we put in £8 million aside for a COVID recovery fund. And at the moment, we're going out and we're consulting with people to find out what they think are the most important things are, and also what's going to help the most. So so things which will prevent things from getting worse as well. So whether it'll be a preventative thing. Anyway, across the council for officers, they've now got forms that they can fill in, and they can say, you know, actually we need, I don't know, 100,000 or whatever it is, which needs to go into the budget for skills and enterprise or helping the parks recover, or there's be a whole gamut of things. And you'll see that when we get to, I always forget whether it's March or April, but around that time, we'll be updating our council plan, because it's all very well a few years ago to say, well, this is what we should do. Well, the times have changed and we need to change with it. But what we have done is put the money aside so that as all this information comes back, we can co-design things with the community to make sure that we are putting in things which will really help. Now, Barry, I think there was a question about how many deaths, and I have it at the tip of my tongue, but I'm not sure whether it's data one's allowed to share, so I'll come back to you.
Yes. No, do you have this?
I've shared the data, because I've shared the ONS data, which is routinely publicly available. I've popped it in the chat. 169 deaths since the beginning of wave 1.
Right.
9th of March. That's the
So there's 100. Yes. So since the beginning of wave 1, which early in March, 169. You asked about the population information. There's 155,000 is the. There's various different ways they estimate what the population is, and it's based on household number or what expectations about migration and natural change. The expectation really was that Kenton and Chelsea's population of 155,000 would rise really quite gradually over the next less than London, which was really some 5%, unless at one point last year people were suggesting that outer London might rise at about 8%. It's now likely that these estimates will be heavily reined back, in my view, and it's likely that our population in Kent and Chelsea will possibly decline. It did decline, has declined before, will possibly decline, and rather than increase. And I think London's will decline as well. I'd be surprised if the estimate of 416,000, I think it is, of Londoners who say that they're definitely going to move. I think that's a very soft estimate because it was done in August. And it wasn't really at the height, certainly after the second wave, and also it wasn't done post the trade deal for Brexit, where a lot of foreign workers have left. So I think the issue is going to be, will London's population drop by more than 500,000 or not? But that's really to be seen. And I think if that's the case, then we could be looking at a drop of nearly 10,000. But I'm speculating in relation to that, to be honest. I haven't seen any formal demographic projections, and I think it's very difficult for people with that role to make formal projections, given the chronic uncertainties at the moment in relation to economy, housing costs, and also movement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Evans.
Yes, thank you very much. Barry, thank you for all your hard work, and to the team and the leader. This has been very comprehensive, and the response to COVID has been really professional. I'm very happy to be part of this borough and part of the council. I wanted to ask a numbers kind of question about, this might go to Barry, I would suspect, and then I have a question for Elizabeth, because the numbers that you mentioned, do they include COVID-related deaths? And if not, what would you estimate? For example, many people who have residents who have elderly parents have lost their parents, perhaps at home, but from a pre-existing, and may have then been hit by the virus and just passed away. I don't think those are included. The mental health deaths, I don't think those are included. Do you have an estimation on that? And as far as the young people now, it's gone, their numbers are higher, and I was wondering if that is only in hospital or people who are dying at home, because it has been said that people are afraid to go to the hospital. Do you have any estimation of what the situation is in that regard?
Well, the first thing to say is that the government clarified what constituted a COVID-related death, and it was if there was a positive test that preceded the death within 28 days. So there's and so when we are reporting on figures, they are deaths of people that were positively tested for having COVID within 28 days of them dying.
So it could conceivably be much higher then.
Well,
significantly higher, I would say.
Well, the total deaths will be higher. The issue that surprised me when I looked at the numbers was that of the people that have died in London's hospitals in the last 5 weeks, only 6% of them didn't have COVID. 94%. That is the. I have to say I read these figures 4 or 5 times before I could believe them. But it's extraordinarily high.
It is extraordinary.
I don't know, Natalia, if I've explained it in ways that you'd be agree with.
Yes,
Yeah, just I could just add one more thing. Is just that we very closely monitor 5-year pooled mortality data, and until very recently there wasn't an increase in all cause mortality in wave 2 compared to before. But now we are seeing there is an increase. So as you said, the deaths, the kind of the excess deaths we are unfortunately now seeing in the data, exactly as you'd expect.
Thank you very much. Now, I wanted to say, Elizabeth, you quite rightly said that we have to review the economic situation, especially in retail and hospitality. And I look forward to some new ideas coming from the council, and we have to respond to that. And I think it's a very positive way of travel for the council. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's not really from the council. It's really asking people what will help them, because we're not the purveyors of all knowledge, you know. And it was interesting at the Grenfell Assembly that on Monday night that some young people were asking, you know, about skills and training, and those would be things that you're looking at in your committee. So I think it's for everyone, isn't it? It's for all councillors, but people in the community to say, you know, what's going to help and how can we come together to fix this. And it'll also be people in the voluntary sector. And that was the whole reason that we thought that we would put aside, you know, a lump of money that we could then know that we would have in order to respond both sensitively but also sensibly to what our residents need. Because wow, if not now, when, right? As Barry said, 100,000 dead and the GDP down by 11%. And we all know people whose businesses are suffering hugely and whose employment prospects are now looking bleak. And we also know many people who have suffered a very grievous time. And I say that word, you know, in its proper sense.
Thank you very much. It's a very positive outlook. Appreciate it.
Councillor Pascal.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Barry and Elizabeth, for both your presentations. My question, I think, is mostly for Barry, but the point that I wanted to ask, and I know you won't have any firm data on this or even a firm projection, but one of the things that I recall is that a large part of our economy in Kensington Chelsea is made up of visitors and people who come to work to support the economy around those visitors. Be they people who come and work in our offices, work in our shops, and then maybe buy things around in terms of services and products during the day. If there is, as a result of COVID, both a reduction in the number of visitors that we have, and also that if part of the trend during COVID to work from home sticks, in other words, we move from perhaps, I don't know, under half a day average working from home to perhaps 1 or 2 days a week working from home, will this have a dramatic effect on the economy of KNC? And is it something that you're going to be looking at as you model the way forward?
I do think there's two sorts of visitors, really. There's international tourists and there's domestic visitors, whether they're from elsewhere in London or visiting from outside of London, whether that's day trippers from the home counties or from further. And the decline of the collapse of international tourism, really. You have to, I mean, if you look at particularly if you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility report on the budget of, I think it's November 20 or thereabouts, it was published, to try to say, well, when will this rebound? I mean, the estimates there were from an optimistic 22 to a pessimistic 26. I think since then, if you were looking at this, you'd probably say an optimistic 23 to a pessimistic 27, 28, to be honest. And particularly if you think about when are we going to see sort of unrestrained tourism? I have to say there is one green lining in all of this, and that is the nitrogen dioxide levels have dropped substantially in London, and particularly in Kensington, Chelsea. They dropped dramatically. I've got measurements for them across 6 parts of the borough, and it's, we're seeing almost a halving. Well, not quite. Certainly a 30 to 40% drop in nitrogen dioxide levels. But international tourism, if it's not around for much of this year, we've seen all the coverage about will we have summer holidays. There's also will people come here, and I think essentially we cannot model on the basis of the information that we have, because it's simply not good enough. We can establish some priors and work out some estimates going forward, but really that's best done at the sort of central London level, at London tourist level, London First and so on, and we'll learn from them. But we need to apply that information to the economy that we have locally, which is, I think, geared towards high-end retail, international tourism and international staying. And I think that means that our economy could well be stalling locally for even longer than the central London economy more generally.
Yeah.
I don't know if Elizabeth wants to.
I think Barry's absolutely right. Chair Will of something called Central London Forward, and I was in conversations today, literally with London First, talking about this and about, did we think any international tourism was going to come back this year? And no, maybe not till, well, next year at the earliest, maybe, as Barry says, beyond that. But there will be a sort of thing in London, I think, of trying to attract people this summer from the home counties, from across London, because we hope that as restrictions lift, as has happened in other countries, there's been a huge, well, if you looked at last summer as well, there's been a huge rebound. So the picture at the moment is bleak, but we hope that by the summer that we might be getting some green shoots and we will be attracting some people in. And we're certainly looking at things within the council about, should it happen, that we're ready to act like this, and that we will be very agile, that we want to get businesses back, that we will be encouraging them, rather than that we'll be stuck in certain ways.
Could I ask one supplementary quickly on the subject I mentioned to do with working patterns, working from home for an increased proportion of the time? I don't expect everybody's going to continue to work from home. A lot of people want to go back for social interaction reasons to the office, let alone anything else. But broadly, over the last 10 years, we've seen a move from virtually no working at home to perhaps somewhere under half a day a week on average. But do you see that after COVID that we might move considerably more to sort of 1 to 2 days a week working from home? And because if we did, the effect of that on our borough would be dramatic as well.
Barry, do you want to take that from the council?
Yes, I think this is this depends on the character of work, and we, in a sense, it's more difficult for us to estimate this because we have people doing fundamentally different things. We have people who do field work every day in the borough, and they're there now. We have people who are visiting clients, service users. There are people that are working from facilities that face the public. There are other people that are essentially, working together, but they're working together in support roles, and the issue will be the changing nature of those support roles, because I think those roles may change, let alone where they're located. And then, of course, there's the preferences of people. Now, we've always relied upon the preference of people to want to work in central London because, bluntly, it's more exciting. I can tell you this from experience. It's more exciting. But when one's experience is, I feel like a submarine commander at the moment, operating without a periscope. When you're completely working at home and you're used to social interaction, in-person social connection is important in work. So what people are saying in terms of their responses about how they want to work in the future in all sectors, including, I have to say, in ours, we've done a lot of work with staff about what they think about the future. People just do like the flexibility that it gives them, but they don't like the sort of constrained nature of it. It's too you're all in or you're all out. And I think that this is going to. The other point I'd say, Councillor Pascal, is that this is happening at a time when automation, artificial intelligence, robotisation is also amplifying the opportunities for digitising many of the tasks and activities that we do. And I think that it won't mean that we'll do away with roles. I think we'll do away with tasks and activities that compose roles, and therefore we'll probably change the nature of our organisation and the staff over time. And I think this is really everything was theoretical, I think, about digital working. Now it's not theoretical. People are using practical experience and saying, here are some limitations in Teams that I'm finding limitations this evening. Here are some limitations. This is what I want to do. This is how it could be done, and so on. And I think all of our colleagues are doing that, whether they're, social workers, housing officers, environmental health officers who are visiting people, and so on. And we need to bear in mind that there are very different roles that we employ.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who's working. If you could relay that to your staff, thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Lindsay now. David?
Just coming on. Thank you. Elizabeth, thank you. Barry, thank you. I think my question is probably more for Natalia. One of the problems with COVID is long COVID. Are councils tracking those who have it, or is it purely a personal thing for GPs and those involved?
Thanks, David. No, great question. So the council, we don't have access to that sort of data, but we are working really closely with NHS and also learning from lots of studies being happening at national level. We know there's going to be a huge impact in terms of long-term health and in terms of people's ability to be in employment. So that data is actually emerging in kind of real time. So we don't have any stats at borough level, and also it's only emerging really at national level. What is the impact? There have been small samples that we know there's been work happening in the north. So absolutely everybody's very, very interested in that as well. And Portland Down's doing a load of research as well on it. So it's a really live question, of which unfortunately I don't have an answer, apart from the fact that we're all watching it very, very closely. And as I said, lots of different sample studies are happening and research happening at national levels.
Okay, I'll call on Councillor Chowan then next, and then Councillor Mason.
Hello, my question is also, well, first of all, thank you, Madam Chair, and also Barry and Elizabeth for an informative presentation. And my question is also following up on the vaccinations and the vaccination centres in particular. It's excellent news that we are having a mass vaccination centre coming to South Kensington, but vaccinations are being delivered in a variety of settings. How many settings do we have in the borough or in the by-borough?
Yeah, so we have a number through the primary care networks through the GP. So there's three main settings for vaccines, essentially. So there's through GPs, there's through the mass vaccination centre, and then there's also through the hospital site. So they're only for health and social care staff.
Community pharmacies, do we have an idea of how many?
They're not online yet, but that's a national programme, but they will be online. And I'm sorry, I can't answer that, but they will be online.
Wonderful. And just to pick up on your answer previously, thank you for the comments you made to Councillor Hammond. But my questions are about the kind of 100% vaccination offers. You said that we're 100%, or we're already there at 100%. Now, in terms of the first priority group, are we like ahead of schedule then? Because that was, but the target date was for the 31st of January.
So what I understood from the North West London call this morning is they're very that all care homes have been visited, and that means, and Gareth will be able to give us some more detail on that, but essentially I think certainly all care home residents have been offered, all staff as well. Of course, there are times and reasons when people can't receive the vaccine for all sorts of different reasons. It might be ill or whatever it might be off. And also they're now making programs, I know, to revisit care homes as well, new staff and things like that. In terms of the 80+ cohort, the CCGs were definitely reassuring us that the offer were being made to all the 80+, and as I said, they felt they were absolutely on target for the 80% jabs in the arm, as it were, for the 80+ population. They felt very confident that they were going to meet the four priority groups by the middle of February, and I can't give you any more detail on numbers. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I was just so it is the 4 priority groups by the February. That's okay. Thanks. I thought there was a distinction between the priority group 1, which was aiming for 31st, and then priority group 2 to 4, which was the target date was for 28th February. But that's good news. Thanks very much for that. Thank you.
And if I could just add to that and say that the next phase of the vaccine rollout is literally being organised by NHS and the military at this, literally during this week and next week. So I think we'll be clearer as the week develops and as we get into next week.
Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Yes, Chair. Can I also, and first of all, praise the excellent job that our staff are doing across the piece with COVID, and the stunning job we see in the hospitals via the TV. Obviously, they're obviously hugely distressed and tired, and one wonders how they can keep going on with the dreadful scenes we are seeing. But without local authorities doing what we're doing, I think we'd be in a much worse position, and I hope the government will recognise that. Now, they are motoring on with the vaccination because, quite out of the blue, I'm having the vax tomorrow morning at the St Charles Hospital. And so therefore I tell everyone, because there are people who say, oh, we shouldn't have the vaccine, it's got this in it and it's got that. And I said, well, I'm having it, and if I'm still alive tomorrow night, you should also go and have it. So if anyone wants to come and take a photograph of me having it and say, listen, it's good enough for the leader of the Labour group, it's good enough for anybody else. But to the submarine commander, of course, excellent packed presentation of the type we are used to getting from you when you do it. You, of course, painted the picture about the universal claimants, 100% increase in Kensington and Chelsea, feeding into the problems of ethnic minorities, women, and we all know those graphs. And I was watching yet another report on one of the TV stations, I think it was the BBC, and they do these graphs about where the worst COVID figure infections and deaths are, and they said the graph they showed across London coincided, the worst infections and the worst death rates coincided with the more, we won't be surprised to hear, less affluent, more deprived, and more areas where people had to go out and work, or where they had to go out and work and couldn't, they were not eligible for one reason or another for either furlough or for the grants, even the grants the leader talked about, because I've put various people onto some of those grants and they're not eligible. And we've seen reports, and it's probably true for North Kensington and World's End and so on, that people who suspect or who maybe think they've got the virus are still going out to work, or they won't answer the phones and so on, and spreading it. We know that because the highest concentrations are in those areas. And the analysis seems to be from the commentators who give us that information is that for one reason or another, there is not enough financial, if people can't feed their families, if they have to live on sickness pay, which I think is about £89 a week, even if you qualify for it, they're not going to sit at home and isolate. They're just not going to do it, basically. So that's an issue. I can't ask you to for the answer to that. But government, and there are businesses open in the hospitality sector, and we see the graph on the hospitality sector, which mirrors exactly what's happening. Most of those that are surviving are furloughed and closed, and some of the ones that can't get furlough or any grants are somehow struggling and open. And if they have to pay business rates, if they're not rescinded again in the next year, I think some of them they will absolutely close. Crime, yes, crime may have dropped, but as you know, we've got a lot of gang war activity, feuding going on at the moment. We had 2 shootings in Nottingdale, or the Norland ward, with tit-for-tat gangs shooting it out with each other. So we have the gangs are inflating. We know that from the police. There are a lot of these young people that can't get any money, or they have no work, and they're going into those gangs. The police will tell you that, and those gangs are at least dealing drugs, and there are people who are able to afford drugs who still have work. And I'm talking about people working in the banks and people who've got a lot of money. So all of that stuff is going on, and we'll have to come back from that. So the question really, I suppose, is we need to get the vaxes. It's going to take a year, I think, until September or October, we're told, until everybody who wants to be vaccinated or can and will be vaccinated, and how we can stop the figures even in the borough, even though they look reasonable at the moment. We thought that last time. We thought in March that it was terrible and that was a plateau. Now it's nearly twice as worse nationally and worse here than it was then. And there are commentators out there saying that this is not ended yet, that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4 waves. It's the same wave, just damped every so often with lockdowns. So, and I was going to talk about economic stuff, but everybody else has covered the economic ground, basically. I think the now is the most important thing, because, the very fact that we have a mass spreading infection and more deaths, over 100,000, as the leader said, there's no reason to suspect it won't become 200,000 in another 3 months, unless we can cover some of those, particularly, because you mentioned it, I'm talking about the more deprived, less affluent, the areas of where people cannot get any legal financial support. Those are the areas where it's raging the quickest, and in my wards and in North Kensington. So the government has to, and those of you in power, and I say at London councils, meetings that I'm allowed to be on, the local government association, we need to put more pressure for more finance for the individual. It's a pity we didn't have the universal basic income. We could just have paid people to pay their rents and the food and so on. There's too many hurdles. There's too many people falling outside the net. There's too many people without money. In All Saints Road this morning, a young man snatched a bag from a woman and ran off with it. I mean, that sort of thing is starting to happen now, even though the crime figures they're desperate. They're absolutely desperate. So we need to do something government-wise to try to fill that gap, or those figures will just keep going up. They're terrible now. They're terrible.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Barry, could you answer some of those points, please?
Yes, I think that the point that's being made, which is about the relationship between general and multiple deprivation, as measured by the government on it biannually. It does this assessment, the last one in 2019. I have to say, I don't think there's a strong relationship at the borough level. It may be there's not even a terribly strong relationship at the ward level. There probably is at the lower super output area level. But we need really to get the evidence for that. And I do know that our colleagues in London Public Health are looking very closely at this, because it does enable very pinpointed targeting of intervention, really. So I do think that that's certainly the case. And the Office of National Statistics published today its research into age standardized mortality rates of people dying with COVID-19 from March to the 28th of December, so until the last 5 weeks, really. And what that shows is that that there are essentially three occupational categories which have double the rate. 2 have more than double, and 1 has sort of 50% higher. And the 2 are caring, leisure, and other service occupations. That's the one big category. And the other is elementary occupations. So these are the very people who are having to work at the front line, therefore putting themselves at risk. And also they're unable to deal with the compensation that's needed for if they don't work, because of they don't have resources to fall back on. So we're talking about people really at the lowest end of the occupational spectrum, who are suffering the most, over the past year, as identified by ONS. There's no question that this is a substantial problem. I have to say that the government have really been very radical and innovative in coming up with solutions of job retention and other things, and sometimes floating and identifying ideas about how to support people. There are ideas in last week I've heard of ideas from government about supporting people so that they don't avoid testing, for example, so they don't avoid testing because they don't want to put themselves economic disadvantage, financial disadvantage. I do think these are really important issues. They're issues about equity and issues about ethics, and they have to be addressed really by our colleagues in the NHS with the way in which they're rolling out the programs to make sure that the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation are the people that establish the priorities. It's not established by discussions amongst managers and politicians. It's actually established by experts in their field. That priority will be rolled out, and I'm glad that the first four will be rolled out quite quickly. But you're right to point to the economic consequences of this, particularly on those who are very insecure, very marginalised. But there's also, I have to say, a really difficult thing for young people, young people's mental health, young people's educational attainments, and young people's employability, as well as young people who are actually in work, who are unable to establish the networks that older workers have that can keep them going for a while, working in a different way. So I do think the impact on young people is extraordinarily high. Normally one says that a recession scars an age cohort, people between 16 and 24, and it scars them for possibly the rest of their lives, certainly for statistically in any way, not everyone in that cohort, but a statistically significant number. This must be the case with young people and their families.
If I could make one supplementary comment, you're absolutely right. Young people are being mentally and economically scarred. There's no question about that. The point I just wanted to make, I absolutely agree with what you've said about the cohort of people who are at the bottom end of the pile, who are being affected the worst. But in the media and on the street sometimes, the increase in COVID, although there are people breaching the COVID rules, the whole discourse sometimes is about it's all happening because these people will not adhere to the rules. And whilst there are some people who will not adhere to the rules, there's a situation you've just described as a response to the question I just gave about the fact that there's a cohort of people, including all those young people, who are in a situation of not maybe being able to comply or economically can't comply for all the reasons you just mentioned. And I think we should say both things really, because people get offended out there. They're not just not complying because they don't want to. Some of them are terrified, but they're also terrified of being dumped on the street or having their families starving, because some young people have got families as well, and they're in a dreadful situation. They haven't built up any savings, etc., etc. So it's both. I know you understand that, but just for the record, Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Pat. Are there any questions from any other members of the committee? Speak up now, or I will take questions from other councillors. Councillor Wade, did you want to ask a question? I think it might have been touched on, but do you wish to answer a question?
No, I think it was covered. Thank you very much indeed. It was the one relating to long COVID.
To the long COVID. Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Smetterling.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much to Barry and to Elizabeth and all the others. First, a remark about long COVID. a brief one. I've got a near neighbour a few doors away who got COVID in March. Not a young man, probably close to my age. He still got it. He's out of breath after a few steps. So it really is important. Anyway, as regarding the state of the council or the borough is concerned, the question I have is, what is the situation regarding support for businesses whose rateable value is above the level for government's automatic government support? I think that's £51,000. What about those who are just above, up to say £65,000, £70,000 rateable value? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. I think I'm unable to answer that at this stage. What I can do is I do know, unless one of my colleagues from finance is here who's dealing with this, which I doubt. Tarin is here. There's the very person Tarin will be able to answer this question, or if not, she will know someone who does.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Barry. And sorry, I haven't got around to changing my background yet, so I wasn't going to come on as early. So above 51,000, particularly those within the retail, leisure, and hospitality sector, which is predominantly where the government support is targeted. You're right in that the first set of grants that came out very early in the lockdown period, it almost was capped at 51,000. However, the most recent set of grants that's come out from government is recognising those that have a rateable value over 51,000. So that threshold has disappeared. So there's a number of different schemes, and I won't go into all the details, but I think there's 6 in total. 1 is a discretionary scheme. The remaining 5 are very much targeted around those that are paying business rates, like I say, in that sector. But just to give you that assurance that government has lifted that 51k threshold, which unfortunately prevented in the very early days lots of businesses getting one of those one-off grants.
Thanks. Sorry, to what though? I didn't get it. Did you say to what level it's raised or it's open?
It's open, yeah. So the only requirement is that they are within the retail, leisure, and hospitality sector, which is quite wide in Kensington. And you're going to ask me the total number of businesses. I believe it's about 4,200, but don't quote me on the exact number. So out of the 9,000, there's about 4,200 businesses. And the reason that there are so many different schemes is because almost there was a different scheme for every time we were in a different tier or a different lockdown. So that's why. But essentially, it's very much targeted around those sectors.
Thank you very much.
So are there any other councillors who would like to ask a question who are here? No, I think we don't have any members of the public. Marwan.
Yes, good evening, Chair, and thanks so much. My apology for joining a little bit late. I was dealing with an issue of COVID related, but not directly influenced by. Thanks so much. I catch up the latest question, especially from the interjection from Barry and the leader, and thanks so much for really addressing this issue of COVID very professional and proactive way. But what I would like to see more, and I would like to ask the question, of course, I mean, COVID has accelerated the adoption of digital transformation, and where we are being forced to accept. And this is maybe to our side in terms of strategic move to accept and in an effective way engage with our residents, our government, and the rest. So what I would like to see, and I would like some clarification, those businesses in the borough who are showing support or incentives to NHS and key workers, employees, do we have any program, a proactive program to support those businesses on an extra, giving them that extra advantage since they are supporting NHS and key workers? This is one. And on the other thing is the open spaces. Of course, we need we need to have our residents access to parks, to enjoy their times there with their family and children. but some in terms of effective communication, that even that you are still carrying, we need that message to be very clear. Is there any strategy on communicating that even if you get the vaccine, this doesn't immune you from carrying the virus? You might be protected, but you still have the virus which you can pass on. So you should be really on your guard. So how communication strategy is working with our the public health departments, especially to do with open spaces? And thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks so much for Barry and Leader for really interesting projection there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor El Nagi. The first issue, which is really about the sort of ecosystem of businesses locally that are supporting other larger employers, we haven't, I don't think, encountered that, and I don't think any authority has done this, but it's certainly something that you've raised, and it's certainly of interest. We should look into this, which is those that are supporting the NHS achieving those health objectives. I can see some difficulties in that, but it is an important issue, and it could be that we through our own comms or whatever could throw some marketing light on people that are supporting the NHS. So it could be that this is more by way of rhetoric than it is by resource, because I'm not sure how we would differentiate between one business and another depending who it was supporting. But you've raised an important issue, I think, and I need to discuss with colleagues is there any potential with that, and also with our leadership team member, Councillor Fawkes.
Thank you.
The other issue really, which is about communication, that a lot of people have thanked me tonight. I really have done very little in relation to this. I'm just proud to be associated with a strong team of people across the whole organisation that are really focused on trying to preserve life and maintain it and make the place livable. And I'm really proud to be associated with all of the staff and the suppliers and our community groups. It's just tremendous work that's being done. And one of the collaborations that certainly we've seen in the last few months has been between our public health colleagues and our communication staff. And that really has been looking at risk communication strategies. How do you explain these heightened risks? I listened very carefully to what Chris Whitty said the other day when he was explaining the risks. He said that for every 1,000 people, he said, in their 60s that got the infection on the original variant, 10 would die. And that in the new variants, the indication was that for every 1,000 people, 13 would die. Now I listened to that and had to sort of set a bit of paper and work it out. What does that mean then? Is that a problem? When would I be worried about? Is 20 a real problem or 15? These are very difficult issues, both for the professionals, but for the public at large. And it's why I think that the work that we're doing, particularly our communities director has been doing work on the sentiment that communities have, the risks that they feel, the vulnerabilities they feel, the attitudes they have towards the vaccine, where some have hesitancy or reluctance in relation to it. We're working then with public health colleagues about getting information, providing information, myth-busting information, where that's right to do so. Whether that information that we're busting is misinformation or disinformation, it always doesn't matter. If it's incorrect, it's incorrect. We need to report on that. So that work really of communication, I would say to you that public health and communications and our communities are working really closely together day to day to work out how to achieve this.
Yeah. I'd just like to add my thanks.
Thank you
as well to them, because you're right, Marwan. It's a very difficult messages to get across, and also things are changing. And as Barry's right as well, it's trying to make things which are unbelievably complex, simple but truthful at the same time. And I hope you will feel that we've achieved it on our website, that we are always updating. We really work very hard with Public Health England, not Public Health, with our own, Natalia and our own public health colleagues, to make sure that anything that we put up is correct. And I think that's really important. And just to say, as an aside to parks, I mean, we know all our parks are just being hugely used at the moment, and it's really helpful that we've just had a renewal of a contract for all the management and maintenance of parks. So I hope in the spring we can carry on with that really high standard that we've always had, because people really appreciate them and need them at the moment. And finally, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Barry and, as he said, all his staff, because I really think they have just done the most amazing job over the last year. And yes, in partnership with the NHS and police, etc., and in partnership with the voluntary sector and within the communities. But as this is the council speaking, I'd just like to say, just the council staff have just been fantastic and really risen to the challenge. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
So,
thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Barry. If we are the first borough to lead that initiative and meet that challenge, that will be excellent. Thank you.
So I would, it falls to me now to thank both Elizabeth and Barry for coming here tonight and for all they're doing to combat this pandemic, and also to thank the staff, because it's very important. This is an issue that is very much on all of our minds, and thank you for coming for your presentations and for answering questions, and for generally the role that LAs are taking in the recovery from this horrible disease. And I'm supposed to sum up, but all I can say is the light at the end of the tunnel is obviously the vaccine. But we all at the moment still have to remain very vigilant. But thank you both, Barry and Elizabeth, for coming along tonight. Thank you. Okay, so we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is about modern slavery. I don't know who's going to introduce the report.
That would be me, Madam Chair. It's Stuart Priestley. I'm the Chief Community Safety Officer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Priestley.
I'm joined this evening by my colleague Robin Phillips, who's the Modern Slavery Partnership Coordinator. So I'll keep this brief, just by way of introduction. So the Council agreed a procurement statement in October last year, which set out the measures it would take to ensure that its supply chains and its suppliers operated free of modern slavery and human trafficking. And as part of the key decision process, when the Council signed off the statement, it agreed to develop and publish a modern slavery strategy, which set out how the Council and the broader partners locally would work together to tackle modern slavery. And what we have today is that we've been working with colleagues to develop the modern slavery strategy, and there's a report for you here today which sort of describes the work we've taken thus far and the general direction. And we ask committee members to note the work that's been undertaken and provide any comments on the proposed structure of the strategy, and we're very happy to take any questions with that. Modern slavery manifests itself in our borough in three key ways. One is concerning young people, and particularly the dynamics of county lines and exploitation in the context of drug markets. Another way concerns mainly women, but not exclusively women, and their transport and exploitation for sexual exploitation and sexual services. And the third area concerns mainly foreign domestic workers operating and exploited via domestic servitude. The Council has already has a number of services which are responding to the needs of victim survivors. So our children's services, adult social care and housing will be identifying victims and responding to their needs. And obviously our community safety services and licensing also play a key role within this. The council has a number of statutory responsibilities under the Modern Slavery Act, and those are in summary to cooperate with the independent anti-slavery coordinator, but most importantly to notify potential victims notify to the government any potential victims of slavery and exploitation. So that's the broader landscape context in which we're developing the strategy. The strategy itself, we are really trying to embrace the concepts of co-design. So we've already undertaken a number of engagement sessions with survivors, victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. We're working with the voluntary community sector and the faith communities. We've engaged a number of professionals from different organisations that are working directly to deliver services to survivors and victims of modern slavery. We've been engaging businesses, and we're also engaging broader conversations with residents around this area. In the paper sort of sets out our proposed approach to the strategy, and I won't go through in any great detail on that because it is included within the paper. But one of the key areas that we're asking people to comment on as well is the framework in which we're developing the strategy is linked to our theory of change, which is included as an annex in the paper, which is structured around 4 themes. And one is around identifying victims, another is around supporting victims, another is that preventing exploitation, and another is that exploiters are identified and brought to justice. And I think that's all I really wanted to say in introduction to the paper. And myself and my colleague Robin are happy to take any comments or questions. So I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Priestley. I've got one question about how closely you work with licensing on this, because I would have thought in the massage parlours, the nail bars, the restaurants, people who are asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, I would have thought that those people would be, you'd get to them more easily than people who were sort of suffering from sexual exploitation or were in domestic servitude, in that licensing already goes in to these places.
So licensing are one of our council services that we work with to train and support, so that they're able to spot that, so they know what the signs of modern slavery is. They know the questions to ask, but as importantly, they know where to get support and what to do. So one of the challenges with modern slavery is that it operates in plain sight. It's a hidden crime. So a big part of what we do is work with our licensing colleagues, but other colleagues who are operating out in the field, and who might come across potential victims of modern slavery, to know what the signs are, know what the legal framework is, know how to be sensitively ask questions, but just as importantly, then know where to get specialist support and help. And my colleague Robin runs a training program, and we seek to train as many of our frontline staff, including licensing, as part of our program.
Thank you. I will now ask Councillor Lindsay to ask a question.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions. Can you, Stuart, thank you for that. Can you give us any case studies? And my second question would be, how many charities, organisations, and I know that you mentioned Rahab, do we have dealing with those affected by modern slavery in the borough? And do all teachers of adults who are learning English as a second language, or the organisations that they come from, have somebody who understands about modern slavery? And I think of, for example, the Clement James Centre, I think, for example, of Westway, and there are half a dozen, I think, other organisations within the borough who do our English literacy for those who do not speak English as a first language. Thank you.
So thank you, David. Three really useful questions. I'm going to actually refer to Robin, who's far more closer to this than I, to pick up on those questions. So I hope you got all of those, Robin.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Stuart. So we will be featuring case studies in the strategy. We just want to be mindful of how we're actually portraying survivors through the strategy and making sure we're doing so that it demonstrates best practice in our coordinated community response and the way that agencies have worked together to support survivors, as opposed to kind of shock factor.
Okay. I think she's frozen.
I think she has frozen.
Oh dear. Okay,
so
maybe
Stuart,
we
that
can
means
come
you're on
back
the
to
deep
it.
end, doesn't it?
So David, I think we can confirm that we will be using case studies. I haven't got one to hand.
Fine.
I'm sure that Robin would. The work with charities. So we have I chair a monthly modern slavery. No, sorry, a quarterly modern slavery and exploitation partnership group, at which at any one time there'll be 30 people within the room, and I would say about 10 of those individuals are representing charities. So we're very well networked in to the charity sector, but we want to do more to expand that. So we see that as part of our ongoing work. I'm just going to welcome Robin back into the lobby. Hi, Robin. I was just talking about your involvement with charities. It's okay. It's part of the new ways of working. I didn't know if you were able to talk about, in response to David's question about teachers of adults for whom English is a second language. Have we reached into that sector?
So you mentioned Clement James, which is an organisation I have delivered training to, and our multi-agency training is open to any professionals working in the borough. It's not an area that we've particularly focused on, but the strategy is the aim is to involve as many organisations and agencies as possible. So I think it's a really good idea for an area for us to focus on more. And Stuart, if there's any of the other points that you wanted me to cover, I'm so sorry for dropping out.
That's all right.
In terms of specialist agencies, obviously you mentioned Rahab. We've also got Calian that supports people exploited in domestic servitude and helps domestic workers with their rights, among others. But I'm sorry, I don't know which ones you've covered.
So I hope that broadly answers David's questions.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take questions from the committee first, and then I'll come on to you, Councillor Blakeman. So, Councillor Hammond.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Stuart and Robin, for the paper. I'm just wondering, do we have a geographic breakdown, perhaps by ward, of the known instances of modern slavery that have been uncovered, and the different types of exploitation that were listed? So, are there any common factors, any patterns that we've seen? Thank you.
So, one of the key things that we've been leading through the modern slavery and exploitation multi-agency group is trying to put in place a framework for all of the partners to share data, de-anonymized, anonymous data, I should say, so that we can build an understanding of the nature and extent of these crimes, because we know that these crimes, as I say, are very hidden, and then the proportion of these offences which are brought to the attention of the state via the national referral mechanism incredibly small. So we are probably better placed than any partnership in the country, I would say, around being able to understand what the nature and extent is. I haven't got to hand the breakdown across the wards. I mean, what I will say is that it should come as no surprise that domestic servitude will be clustered around Chelsea and Kensington, and less so in North Kensington. The sexual exploitation, similarly, we see that clustered, whilst that operates borough-wide, we see that clustered across central and south. Robin, I don't know if there's anything you could add to that.
No, I think that sounds quite conclusive. We'll be including more detail for data in the strategy as well, with some infographics and maps as well that might be useful.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Evans.
Thank you very much for this discussion. A few questions, please. Could you talk us through what happens once you find a young person? What happens to them further down the line once they've been referred to one of the agencies? And also, what happens if the person is a minor but does not want to cooperate? Do we go by age and say that we can enforce? Because some people, they actually prefer that lifestyle. And what is the difference between a sexual exploitation and escorts in terms of minors?
Well, in terms of minors, it's all safeguarding. So in terms of minors, we would exercise the authority safeguarding processes where we identify young people who may have been trafficked for the purposes of selling drugs, such as the county lines model. We will work with various services, with the police, and with the voluntary and community sector, who provide specialist services to support young people who have been victimised in such ways to recover. There is a service which is commissioned directly from the GLA, specifically to support young people who have been identified outside of London via county lines trafficking, to support them and then bring them back to London and link them back into support services. Robin, did you want to add to any of that, particularly in the context of young people and sexual exploitation?
Yeah, so just to start with, so young person with the context of human trafficking and modern slavery is defined as anybody under the age of 18 years old. And with the legal definition of human trafficking, what's called the means, so the method of control, which could be deception or coercion for an adult, is not necessary to meet the definition of human trafficking for a child. So you just need the movement or recruitment or restriction of movement and the exploitation of a child. There doesn't need to be evidence of force or coercion there. So we would see any form of exploitation of a child as modern slavery in that context. So in terms of the response, as Stuart said, absolutely children safeguarding. And if they're under the age of 18 and the local authority believes that they might be a victim of modern slavery or human trafficking, we have a duty under the Modern Slavery Act to refer that young person to the national referral mechanism. Therefore, they are known to the Home Office, and it, although it doesn't give them additional support as it does for an adult, it also helps with things like the Section 45 defence that says that as they are a victim of modern slavery, their crimes that they might have committed during that time, such as drug dealing, should be taken in the context of them being a victim of exploitation, as opposed to an autonomous person acting in their own right and will. However, we do know that there is also a dichotomy between perpetrator and victim, and it does get complicated, especially when young people who we believe are victims of modern slavery are also grooming other young people and therefore creating further victimization. So it is a complicated process that the YOS are very experienced in responding to, but definitely safeguarding first and foremost. In relation to sexual exploitation, all forms of sexual exploitation of children is child abuse, and we cannot say that there is any such thing as child prostitute or child escort. The age range still stays as under age of 18 is considered a child. So a child selling sexual services is child sexual exploitation until they are age of 18, in which case we need to identify that deception or coercion in terms of whether it's sexual exploitation or an adult selling sexual services. I hope that helps clarify.
Yes, it does. And that would apply to girls and boys, men and women. Right.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting that in many forms of exploitation, sexual exploitation crosses over with that as well. So, for example, with the criminal exploitation, we also see sexual exploitation of children, or children being asked to plug drugs inside them, which would constitute as sexual exploitation or child abuse as well. So there's lots of crossover with sexual exploitation and other forms of modern slavery.
Well, thank you. That's very informative.
Councillor Chowan. Max.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Stuart and Robin. And I'd like to ask specific questions, probably slightly detailed, about it's in relation to agenda, so item 3.2 on page 2, and it's in relation to the data that you obtain from multi-agency partnerships and modern slavery and exploitation group. I've looked through the paper. I've seen multi-agency and the word agency come up several times, but I'm trying to figure out what these agencies are. I understand you've got local authority, the police, and adult safeguarding works across, and child safeguarding works across these organisations. But is there a list? Maybe I've overlooked it, but is there a list of agencies that are involved in this?
The list isn't included in the paper, but it will include the third sector organisations such as Rahab and others that we're working with, Kellyanne, health providers, housing providers, those organisations working with street populations such as rough sleepers, housing. So it's a very healthy multi-agency partnership. I don't know, Robin, are there others that I've missed in that list?
No, they're the main ones, Stuart.
Yeah.
And do they meet? Are they like standing attendees at meetings? Are the same people there at each meeting, or their representatives, or is it kind of a disparate, like a not a regular group? It's more ad hoc. I mean,
I think it's what we.
And how
yeah. Well, the meetings are quarterly.
Okay.
And then there are subgroups which might be focused on various task and finish areas such as training and other areas. The meetings are quarterly. We try to encourage a consistency of membership. And I think we're broadly successful in that, actually. And that's just off the top of my head. I think it's a very well attended meeting. And I think we're broadly successful, as I say, in keeping and sustaining the membership and not just having kind of, as you described, sort of ad hoc folk come from the different organisations, because that does affect the ability of us to kind of conduct business and the depth of the conversation that we can have. And I think it's a. I mean, I would say this because I chair it, but I think it is an effective forum at being able to understand the issues, share best practice, share information, and to develop our work program, our ongoing work program. And others external to us, such as the Home Office, have come in and sat in our partnership meeting and given us some very positive feedback.
That's excellent. Just a follow-up question on the kind of incidents. You stated that in the paper 500 incidents in kind of a 4-borough. Is it 3 to 4 boroughs? Yeah, 2. Sorry. And could you tell me? I think Councillor Hammond may have asked the same question. Do we have figures for Kensington and Chelsea? I mean, can we separate them from these 500?
I think I'm going to ask Robin now. I've not seen that data, but I don't know if Robin, if you're able to comment on that question.
I am, yes. So with obviously the nature of modern slavery being so hidden, it's extremely difficult to quantify, and so many data sets rely on estimates. But Kensington and Chelsea has done an amazing job actually in terms of progressing this area of work and actually bringing to light the number of cases that happen within the boroughs. It is on a 3-borough basis, so across the BCU, with Westminster and Hammersmith and Fulham, as it's still a 3-borough partnership. So
3-borough.
3-borough, yeah. So the data that's collected, as you mentioned, is from 10 different multi-agency partners, including police, including hospitals, including NGOs and the local authority. And that is collected from across all 3 boroughs. So the 500 plus incidents that occurred between April 2019 and November 2020 are across all 3 boroughs. It's also key to note that that data is obviously limited because we're not collecting it from outside the borough. So if somebody was recruited within Kensington and Chelsea but exploited in Lambeth or even Scotland, we're not actually capturing that data within this data set. So it's got its limitations, but it's also got its positives, and it's given us a real insight into exploitation in the area. And the reason I'm kind of giving you all this preamble is because when we kind of say the figures, it needs to have the context behind it. So out of those 500, let me just double check before I, so we know that 200, and we can break it down, so it's a by-borough strategy. So out of the 500 survivors of modern slavery that were identified, we know that 204 of those were either recruited or exploited in Kensington and Chelsea or Westminster. And the remaining 300 may well have been recruited or exploited in the boroughs, but that's not recorded, or it might be that they were either identified in the boroughs or supported here. So we're trying to capture that whole range. But those numbers are probably just the tip of the iceberg. That doesn't include, as I say, survivors that have been identified elsewhere that were exploited or recruited in the borough, and it doesn't include all those survivors that sadly haven't been identified yet and are still not accessing support.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Chairman, I apologise if somebody else covered this while I had to go to the men's room. 6.3 survivors and asylum seekers, no legal right to public funds and no legal right to work. Obviously, Robin, it's a recipe for slavery. It's a recipe for every type of
exploitation
against these people. I mean, obviously they're hidden, as you say. What is there any way? I mean, obviously they just pop up, but is there any way of stopping these people coming in or being enticed into the country, or they are off the grid basically? What happens? Do you only find them when they pop out of the woodwork, or somebody raids one of those places where they are working or being slaved?
Robin, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think just to kind of say that the majority of survivors of modern slavery that's been identified in the UK over the last 3 years now, the majority of those have actually been British. So it's always kind of just to highlight that. But in terms of asylum seekers or people with no recourse to public funds, as you say, very vulnerable to exploitation, especially if there's no recourse and somebody is offering you £3 an hour, and £3 an hour is better than no pounds an hour. Definitely vulnerable to exploitation in many forms. I think it's worth touching here upon the barriers to disclosure, so reasons why survivors might not come forward and ask for help. So obviously, for people with no recourse to public funds, fear of removal from the country is kind of paramount. Fear of being returned to their own country, fear of authorities, and that might be because they can't trust authorities in their home country, or it might be that their exploiter has told them, don't trust the police, don't trust the council, they'll put you in prison, they'll take away your children, whatever it is that's being spread. Obviously, language barrier and actually physically not being able to ask for help is a major hurdle for people to come come over to ask for help. Overcome is the word that I was looking for, and amongst many other barriers. So even when I think licensing were mentioned at the beginning as well, even if there is suspicion or concern by somebody in licensing about somebody working in a shop, for instance, it's very difficult to then ask the right questions for that person to feel comfortable and confident saying, yes, I actually am being exploited. So whether that's that their exploiter is present, whether that's that there's no certified interpreter, really difficult for somebody to say, actually, yes, I do need support, which is also why we see such low numbers in comparison to what there probably actually is out there. And another reason in terms of all the barriers why people with no recourse to public funds are even more vulnerable in being kind of in further exploitation or even re-exploited once they've come out of exploitation, just because of those barriers to support.
Yeah, we've read the reports. Thank you. It's ghastly. It's terrible. There seems no end to it. It really will take central government action to deal with this. If people are paid properly or they have rights, then they may not be available to be exploited. But I think this is something central government has to take responsibility for, because we and you are working with your hands tied behind your back in this situation. Okay.
Okay, Councillor Ali.
Thank you, Chair. And if I take the opportunity to thank Robin and Stuart for the great report, I just want to know if you can tell us, just follow-up questions to what Councillor Mason have been asking you. In terms of the slavery and sexual exploitation, they go hand in hand. And we know most of the people that actually, a number of population that hasn't been mentioned are students. And we have a great university here, and and people may live in the borough and actually go to university other areas. So could you specifically mention students who've going through difficulties if you came across and in fact of that data? But the second point that I would like to ask the question is in terms of the sexual exploitation and the reasons why people are doing it, but we know sexual exploitation happens in brothel house, in prostitution. Do we know the number of areas where designated areas, let's say, of prostitution in the borough? And if so, do we know if the people working there, whether that's a man or woman, whether they are being pushed or they are being forced to do what they do? Do we have specific details about, or how do you carry out to actually know if people there operating in that environment are working on their own free will rather than being enslaved or being pushed to do what they do? It's not easy situation, but I just wish if you could give us a bit more details on that front.
So I'll sort of pick up on the last question, if I may. So we work very closely with an organisation called Rahab, and they work to identify women who are involved in prostitution and to support them to exit prostitution. And they work very closely with the police as well. So we will we will receive within the community safety team, but also the police and Rahab will receive reports where there may be prostitution operating from a premises. I should say that there is very little on-street prostitution. The vast majority of the prostitution that operates within our borough is from premises. So Rahab and the police will identify potential brothel, and they will go and they will seek to engage with the women that are working there. And over a period of time, they will seek to engage, to understand, to provide services. And through that engagement and over time, often disclosures come where they can identify women who may have been a victim of human trafficking, modern slavery, or may have been exploited and coerced. And if my colleagues from Rahab were here, what they would say is that there is a continuum of sexual exploitation. And at the one end are those people who are actively coerced and kidnapped, if you like, or tricked and made to go from one place to another and held against their will within sexual slavery, if you like. But there's also a broader group who are held sort of against their will through coercion, exploitation, threats, and those threats can be explicit or implicit, but they're held within a place of exploitation. So very much organisations like Rahab, working really closely with the police, work to identify and support those women to exit those exploitative situations, be they human trafficking and referral to the NRM, or slightly less explicit than that. So they will support them to do that, to exit that exploitative situation. I hope that answers that part.
Yeah, just follow-up question, if you don't mind, Stuart, on this.
No problem.
Do you know the number of brothel houses or homes in RBKC? How many are they roughly? Or
I haven't got that to hand, but our police colleagues will have, and Rahab will have an understanding of that. It won't be a definitive number. Robin, I don't know if you have an idea around that.
I don't have no. Sorry.
So
sorry.
If knowing the number of such environmental, people are operating, will allow the offices and the council authority to actually know where things are happening, and actually to know if there are people who have been exploited. If we don't have the figures, maybe we will have later on further details, or maybe Robin will tell us more. That will allow us to know exactly what's happening in our local area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. But I think often these houses they operate under the radar, and they sometimes do that for years. Actually, Robin, I don't know if you can add to that.
So I've actually found a figure. So between 2013 and 2020, Rahab has visited 317 premises in the borough. Not all of those will be confirmed, but that's the number of premises that they've been alerted to. And a lot of those will have been visits, as Stuart says, with the police, and focused on welfare checks and risk assessing, and offering support.
Thank you.
Now, what about the student part, if you don't mind, if you have any figures on that?
Yeah, sure. It's not actually something that I've come across that's come to my attention within the borough, but I think also worth mentioning the kind of heightened vulnerability that COVID has brought, and more people being vulnerable to exploitation without a job. As we saw earlier, the kind of increased number of people on universal credit, and people kind of being vulnerable to job offers that are just not as they seem. I think with the student population, there's also risks of online sexual exploitation. But again, that's kind of just my thoughts. It's not anything that I've had concrete. Student population isn't something that's been brought to my attention.
All right. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
Councillor Blakeman, your hand has gone down. Do you wish to ask a question? I know you've been waiting patiently. Okay, so I will ask Councillor Spalding.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to raise one issue. Congratulate Mr. Priestley and Robin on the work that they're doing. It's absolutely vital work, and we all recognise that. And there have been some terrible tragedies in people's lives, and they have 100% support from all of us in this borough, all decent people. But I wonder if we're talking about modern slavery. I just briefly refer to historical slavery. And we've seen recent disturbances when people have referred back to historical things that have happened in previous generations who were not so educated and enlightened and indeed experienced as we are in being, multi-ethnic, which is how we all live nowadays. But I would like to say there's a positive aspect to this for this borough where we were really a world leader. And I wonder if we could make reference to this somewhere, because in 1789, of course, William Wilberforce became the MP for Hull, and he has a statue erected in Hull. But by in 1789, actually, he introduced the first legislative move anywhere in the world, really, to abolish slavery, and it was not successful. It didn't get passed, but it did get passed by 1807. And of course, he lived in this borough. Wilberforce lived at 44 Cadogan Place, and indeed he died there in 1833. So I think this borough itself ought to celebrate that somebody from RBKC was the person who first got, together with Haiti and the US, in those sort of 1805, 1807 period, got slavery absolutely banished and made illegal. And in this country, it came from this borough. And I wouldn't go so far as to say we've got to erect a statue to Wilberforce as the abolitionist, but it's something I think we should note somewhere, that for those 200 and more years, this borough has been trying to lead in abolition of this awful episode in human history. And so I support everything Mr. Priestley's doing. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Spalding. Councillor Wade, did you wish to ask a question as well?
Yes, there are incidents of women who come in as domestic servants who come into this country on what they call the family passport system, and actually hand their passports over to their employers, which effectively leave them in a position that they can't leave the country. I'd like to know what work has been done in that area, and how that how it can be best identified. This is work that's been done by the Passage in Westminster, where some of these women have presented themselves.
It's a very good question, Councillor. Thank you very much for that. I think I'm going to hand over to Robin for this. I mean, certainly we work very closely with Callian, who are a local-based charity working in this area. So I'll again ask Robin just to update you on our work to tackle domestic servitude.
Thank you. Yes, really good question, and definitely something that we need to highlight in the borough. Our numbers, along with neighbouring boroughs, are much higher than those London and also England-wide. So it is definitely something that we need to focus on. And this is something that kind of came up as a unfortunate trend that we were seeing in the data that we were collecting from multi-agency partners, especially Filipino women in domestic work here, and then being exploited. So not accessing pay, as you say, not having access to passports, and working excessive working hours without breaks. So what we did was we ran a proactive campaign online. Whilst I work with the council, I'm also employed by the charity Stop the Traffic in partnership with them. And their role is to gather data and intelligence from across the world about human trafficking, and then map that in routes and hotspots and work with experts on the ground and communities to try and prevent human trafficking from happening. And the way that they do that is through a partnership with social media companies. So running geo-targeted adverts. So if you have Facebook, you might have adverts pop up on your Facebook feed that tells you that you should buy a pair of sunglasses or something. Well, Stop the Traffic uses those advertising credits for good. So we can reach specific demographics. So in this area, we chose to reach Filipino women within a certain age bracket who were living or working in the boroughs, and who had an interest or listed their profession as a domestic worker. And we could then reach them on social media through a social media campaign that made sure that they were aware of their rights. So this is the minimum wage that you're entitled to. These are the number of hours you're allowed to work without, and then you should have a break. You're entitled to sick pay. You're entitled to holiday leave, and then signposting to specialist support, Calayan, as Stuart mentioned, and also the Voice of Domestic Workers and a number of other charities in London, should they need advice and support. And it was a hugely successful campaign. And it's actually one of the case studies that's in the strategy. So the campaign reached 48,000 people in our target audience within the boroughs. So that's Kensington and Chelsea, but also neighbouring boroughs, so Westminster, Hammersmith and Fulham. And it's also covered Ealing as well, just because of the way that the social media reach was working. And 10% of those clicked through from this advert that we sent out to them to learn more on the website, which is actually a huge, sounds small, 10%, but it's actually double the average that we normally see in our campaigns at Stop the Traffic. So really successful engagement. And we run pre and post campaign surveys as well to make sure that we're actually monitoring the effectiveness of the campaign. 90% of the post campaign survey respondents said that they found the campaign helpful, and 42% that they contacted said that they contacted an organisation for advice and support. An additional 37% said that they added the phone numbers of the support organisations to their phone, which emphasises the preventative nature of this campaign as well. So not just if they're being exploited now can they reach out for help, but actually if they find that their rights are compromised in the future, they can also reach out for support then. So that was a really positive example of multi-agency working, proactive, preventative response to one area of modern slavery in the borough.
Thank you.
So thank you. I think now it's 9 o'clock and we'll have to move on. So it just remains to say thank you, Stuart and Robin. We look forward to reading the strategy, and perhaps you'll bring it to the committee at a later date.
Certainly will. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what I propose to do, it is now 9 o'clock. We have to look at the budget. We have to look at the HRA budget and also the budget working group. So what I'm proposing is we do those three financial items, and the work programme and the forward plan will have to be either postponed to the next meeting, or we can have a meeting we'll arrange a meeting between the chairman to discuss those things. What does the committee think? Silence.
Yes. Good plan.
Okay. I think we'll carry on anyway. I know we're probably going to go on till 10, but if we start now with Councillor Wheel and Taryn introducing the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Taryn's going to introduce today.
Okay, right.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I'm conscious of time, so I won't say an awful lot. So there are three reports which you've just highlighted today around the draft budget. The first, which I'm just going to say a couple of words on, is the General Fund draft budget for 21-22 and the capital programme, and then pass over to Kim, who is going to take us through the HRA. So in terms of the first report, so the first part of the report very much provides a bit of a narrative around proposed spending plans for 21-22. It assumes, what I should say is it assumes at this stage of the budget process that all of the savings that have been put forward to date do go ahead, which you've obviously seen over the last couple of months. However, just to stress that they are still subject to consideration, both in terms of the feedback from the consultation exercise, which I'm going to touch on very briefly, and also the feedback from the Overview and Scrutiny Working Group, which lead members will consider before leadership on the 10th of February. The report very much does focus on, it's not the whole council budget, it's very much focused just on the service budget, and in particular current budget compared to the movements proposed for next year. So it incorporates inflationary increases, which you'll see set out in the appendix, the proposed savings and how they get translated into service budgets, and also the 6 million of growth pressures that's going in for next year. So I wasn't necessarily going to run through any of the detail because hopefully it's encapsulated in the report, but I just wanted to touch on the feedback from the consultation exercise. So at the time of dispatching the papers, the consultation was still underway. So it closed on the 21st of January, and I know we've talked about this to the working group. So we went out, we did consultation on the website, dedicated with businesses, newsletters, partners, and with the voluntary and community sector as well. The number of responses is very much in line with last year. So we received at the deadline on the 21st of January just 5 responses. There were 2 people that supported the proposals, 2 that opposed, and 1 that didn't comment either way. What I would say is the feedback that we received didn't necessarily challenge any of the proposals, but there were certainly some ideas put forward, and I'm just going to run through those very quickly. There's only a couple of them, but just to say that lead members will then be considering each of these before we come up with a draft budget on the 10th of February. So just a couple of the areas that were flagged up by people. So a couple of people highlighted that they wanted to see increased investment into transport, and in particular looking at cycling and walking facilities across the borough. There was talk about increased investment into High Street Kensington. I think that's quite topical. I think we've heard a lot about the economic impact of COVID. So that was one of the feedback, some of the feedback that came through. Certainly an area that was flagged as a concern by one particular respondent was around digital exclusion, or should I say digital inclusion, and making sure, I think, that some of the concerns that have come out from COVID that we addressed. Others around investment into new homes, and then finally just a look at libraries and the role of libraries within the borough. So like I say, I'm not going to talk about any kind of responses. I just wanted to highlight the areas so that Overview and Scrutiny were aware, but lead members will consider that along with the feedback from the working group when they put together the draft report. So that's all I was really going to say at this stage. Like I say, all the numbers are in the report. There isn't any savings that you haven't already seen. They've been doing the rounds since last November. Budget pressures, I think you've seen in the various reports that went to leadership teams. So hopefully this is a case of just translating for you what it looks like in service budgets. Mary, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Not at this stage, no. Thank you very much. That's covered it brilliantly.
Okay, thank you, Taryn. Councillor Hammond, you have a question.
Thanks very much, Chair. Well, I've got a sort of an overall question, and then I've got some detailed ones. So I'll start with the big picture one. And there's obviously been some significant uncertainty this year for obvious reasons. How confident are you, Taryn and Mary, that the basis for the report that you've presented to us today will still be valid when the budget's finalised?
I think I'm fairly confident because we've got, there's potentially some more government money coming next year already that we know about. I mean, we can't be confident. These are definitely unusual times, but I'm as confident as I'm more confident than I might have hoped to be at this stage, that we're making a reasonable assumptions for next year's budgets. Taryn, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, and we've kind of talked about uncertainty certainly through Barry and Elizabeth's presentation, and I think, we can come up with so many different scenarios about what next year would look like, but I'd probably say hand on heart, none of them would be precise, but we are looking at that. What we haven't done at this stage is necessarily budgeted for any significant COVID pressures. We know that there will be some continuation into 21-22, certainly for the first part. And as Mary said, we've received a series of government funding already. That was announced as part of the settlement. So government grant of 5.6 million, additional support for those with council tax. We're still expecting an increase in people requiring council tax support. So already the government has announced something for next year. We know that there's going to be a continuation of the income loss scheme, which they've got in place at the moment. That will continue till June. Hand on heart, do we know whether it will all be back to normal by June? We probably don't, but I think that's probably a really good, probably stock take on where we are at the end of June. What we can't say is whether, that will be sufficient, but we're doing very, very detailed monitoring actually on the financial position. We have to do monthly returns to government, and we are intended to continue that right through 21-22. So I think certainly Overview and Scrutiny Committee will get a very, very early heads up if, for any reason, we don't think that, whether we think, it's even more uncertain than what we planned for. But at this point in time, I feel confident that it's a robust budget going into next year. And what I would say is, as you can probably imagine, London boroughs, there's lots of talk amongst ourselves about how we're approaching things for next year. And it is pretty much in line with the approach that's been taken by other authorities because it's so difficult to predict.
Thanks very much, Taryn, and thanks, Mary, for your answer. Could I turn to just a few points of detail, please, for questions? In the HRA budget, page 11, I was a little surprised to find we own some garages in Norwood Green in Southall, which is quite a long way from Kensington and Chelsea. I'm just wondering why we have these, what sort of legacy project they're from, who uses them, how many are there, what's their value, what's the yield, as they're obviously, at least some of them are let at the moment, as there's a rental price for them. So that's my first set of questions. Second one is, I know we've got again in HRA, we've got a significant tidy commercial property portfolio of 166 properties. Can you tell me what the overall yield of that property portfolio is, please, and what the range of yields is from naught, obviously, because I'm sure we've got some voids up to what's the best one in there, and you may not have those figures to hand. And the final one, on a real point of detail in the capital budget, the 2 lines on the maintenance of historic built features, I think contains a mistake in the new year 3 for this year's budget, which I think should, this was the result of my working group, should contain a new £50,000. I did copy you on some email correspondence, but I wonder if you would agree with that point or if we need to take it offline. So those are my 3 points of detailed questioning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hammond. If I can work backwards, actually, because
sure.
Probably the last one is the one that I can answer, and apologies, I did email back to officers, but I hadn't copied you in. So you're right. So within that third year, 23-24, there should be a 50,000. So I've got the figure. It's 200,000 in total. It was 121-22, and then 50k in each of the following years that follow. So apologies, I will pick that up. But certainly in the capital programme that's coming up to February leadership team, that was definitely the profiling that was shown. So please be assured, because I know obviously it's a project that you've been working on, that final 50,000 is in there, and I know that it's certainly an area you're looking at, and if there is a future requirements, then we can pick up, or anything over and above the 200k, then we can pick that up as a subsequent conversation. So that's that. Yeah,
it's actually 250k, and it's the last 50k I think that appears in that year 3. So I think we've had 200 appearing already from, and it appears on 2 different lines in the capital budget for some reason.
Okay, all right. Apologies, and I thought I'd resolved that, but let me take that one.
I think you have. If you put another 50k in year 3, you have resolved it. And
okay, okay. But I know certainly there was 50,000 in 23-24, so hopefully we've resolved, but let me take that away to double check to make sure it's reflected in the final papers for February. In terms of the commercial property portfolio and the garages, I'm really sorry, would you mind if I come back to you? They are very specific questions, and yes. I've got lots of figures to hand ready for lots of questions, but those were the 2 that I hadn't anticipated. So if that's okay, I don't know, Kim, whether whether you're aware of the garages, and I just haven't got that knowledge, whether Kim wanted to add anything to those questions.
No, I'm just saying that I'm aware that we own lots of funny things all over the place, but the garages are new to me. So as Taryn says, we'll have to go back and look at it. And I think just in terms of the rent, in terms of the commercial rent, again, we can give you the detail on. Suffices to say that that's proving to be a real challenge for us at the moment. We're having to give a lot of concessions to our commercial tenants who aren't faring very well. So you know that there is an impact in terms of on our income, quite significant at the moment.
Yeah, perhaps coming back on that last point, Kim, I'd be quite interested in the yield for the last normal year as well, just as a comparative, because obviously we've had a disastrous year and every landlord's had a disastrous year. So it's not fair to use this year that we're just exiting as being the point of comparison. But I'd be very interested to hear some answers to those questions when you've had a chance to examine them in more detail.
Yeah, just to finish, to say that we've obviously put in a range of support packages for people as well in terms of his team. The policy we take is it's better to keep a tenant than lose one, and particularly tenants who've been with us for a long period of time. You know, we do need to support them through thick and thin.
Yeah. And just to add it, in terms of those support packages, the work that's fed into that is almost a detailed line by line exercise looking at each of our properties. So we've certainly got that. And Councillor Hammond, you picked up around current year yield versus, you know, kind of pre-COVID rate. So I do know that exercise has been done, because I know it was used to almost shape what support packages we need to be thinking about putting in place. So we'll follow that up with the data.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah.
So do any other members of the committee have any questions about the budget proposals? No? Okay. So I will move on and invite Councillor Taylor-Smith to introduce the budget proposals for the HRA.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Although I am going to rely on Taryn to give me some of the detail, I really just wanted to say a very few words. Obviously, what we're presenting you today are the two components. It's obviously the revenue account and both the capital account. On the revenue side, you know, we are facing some real challenges at the moment. Councillor Hammond, we've just discussed one of them in terms of rental collection. I think arrears is another one in terms of council tax arrears. We've seen a correlation of increased arrears that match the increase of people going on universal credit, you know, which is going up by 50%. I would also like to take this opportunity, apart from obviously thanking Taryn and Mary for the construction of these budgets, but also the staff. I mean, I've just talked about rent collection. We have changed our policy, obviously, very much. We're not doing fault of any eviction or any legal letters. We've upped the numbers of calls, going from 8,000 to 14,000 over last year. And I think they've done a fantastic job in maintaining the collections. Overall, our collections are running at 98%. So I wish it was the same as far as the commercial side is concerned. Obviously, as far as the revenue is, things we're looking very seriously about our income and our council rent. We're also, you know, very conscious of some of the things coming up on the on horizon for us. Things like, for instance, the rebating of water rates. I think just on the capital front, we have a very ambitious capital programme that's going through at 267 million. Again, we're seeing pressure there in terms of the capital works, not just in terms of now we're going out to tender, and we're obviously very much concerned about the impact that Brexit is going to have on some of those tender prices, but also we've given a commitment in terms of greening our stock, and that's going to again result in an increase in our capital expenditure. I mean, to combat that, what we're doing is we're looking to engage some specialists to actually look and advise on our portfolio and see how we were going to face this challenge, rather than just resorting to a higher level of borrowings. So just to end up again, I just want to reiterate my thanks in terms of the housing team, you know, because they're doing a very good job and maintaining services during extreme restrictions. Taryn, do you want to add to the nuts and bolts of the report?
I can do, or I'm sure there will be some questions, but we can. The only thing I was going to add, Kim, was so again at the time of dispatch of the reports, the TCC committee
yes.
taken place, and I know you were there as well. So I just wanted to give the verbal feedback that TCC talked about the detailed budget for next year, but also some overarching key messages about the kind of business plan, and as you say, some of the uncertainty and the requirement almost to do that external expertise and looking at what is the best option for what is a significant capital programme. And it's quite unusual to come back in year with a new business plan, but we think it's absolutely the right approach to be taking this year to make sure that one, we're investing in the right way, but also our funding of that investment is right as well. But I was just going to flag in that broadly supportive at TCC. I think there were a couple of really specific questions that certainly Steve raised for me. So I didn't know if you wanted to give any feedback from TCC.
Again, I think very broadly supportive. It was a very interesting debate. I mean, particularly when we talked about the challenges on our capital programme, and there was interest to understand what range of things that we might do beyond extending the programme in terms of borrowing money. One of the issues that we talked on is a review of our assets. And we need to consider some of those assets again. We've always given a pledge that we're not in the business of selling council homes, but there was a real understanding as TCC that where we have standalone properties with high maintenance costs, that's something that we should consider. Where if we're going to be under severe financial pressure, but that's not something we're changing our policy on at the moment. But I think it just gives an illustration of the range of discussions that we had at the meeting, but a positive response.
Thank you. Could I ask quite a broad question, Kim? In that the service charge is going up, the rents are going up, the heating's going up. We know that the mayor is going to put his precept up. And also this is a very difficult time for people. I mean, I understand why you have to put things up, but have you taken that into consideration, that some people just won't be able to afford to pay all the extra charges, even though individually it doesn't seem so much, but when you add it all together, it could be quite a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to realise is obviously a large proportion of our council tenants are in receipt of benefits, and so consequently the cost actually goes through. Although we do have to be very conscious that we get caps and where we might impact on taps. I think the team that we have who are dealing with people arrears, and we've got different departments. We've got some that are dealing with vulnerable people and people talking to our general residents with our property, are very good at contacting and support of our residents in order to see them through this process. But I have to acknowledge that yes, costs are going up across the board, and we have to be very conscious of those costs and see how we might better support our residents in order to have those. But we've got our own pressures as far as the HRA is concerned, and we obviously have to seek to ensure that we maintain a balanced budget.
Thank you. Councillor Pascal.
Thank you, Chair. The question I wanted to ask to Kim, I think probably, is you mentioned HRA capital, the cost of greening and the challenges that might bring forward. I heard from Doug Goldring the other day that he is looking at additional sources of capital finance to aid that objective. Is there anything you'd like to add in this context about that?
Yes, again, I mean, the team has done a really good job in terms of securing grant funding as well for some of the greening projects, and with particular success on the Lancaster to West Estate, and that's obviously going to very much help us ameliorate the overall cost. There is other sources of funding available in us to do that, but we are flagging. I mean, the problem with flagging the issue, in as much that the problem we have is our average housing stock is probably 1960. These are old buildings. They are going to present great challenges to green, to complete, to be carbon neutral. And our experience at the moment indicates that you get a level of cost the extra, if you want to go from sort of 80% carbon neutral to 100, the exponential cost is quite high. So that's something which, again, we might have to look at using dreaded things like carbon offsets. But that's something which we're still working on.
Because what I wanted to I understand that the progress has been made in relation to Lanc West, but with the statements coming from central government, the Environment White Paper, through the London Local Plan, and the fact that Boris is going to be chairing, I think it's called COP21 in Glasgow this year, the International Conference on Climate Change, it strikes me that the leadership, weather, if you like, is going in the direction of requiring earlier performance rather than 2050 compliance for UK overall, and therefore central government is going to have to align some of its financial support with the need, the ask they're making for local change. So we have the commitment to 2030 conversion of our stock to being carbon neutral, and that would seem to be a very good argument to go to central government. Not just on the demonstration project like Lanc West, but for the wider HRA requirement for capital.
We're doing that. I mean, we have somebody now that we've recruited whose specific task is to do that. And at the moment, let's say we've shown some good success in terms of our wins. It is certainly a priority. But equally, one would argue that a greater priority is to ensure that people have the ability to flush their lavatory and go up and down in a lift. So I mean, the fabric and condition and the way we're front loading the building is obviously very important. We have to have a balance on it, but we do stand by the commitment and are determined in order to do
my question is, obviously I appreciate that there needs to be a balance, and perhaps to Taryn, in terms of the way in which the HRA capital is presented for the future budget years, has there been some planning done with regard to anticipating the extra costs which would be incurred, but also the potential extra income that might be forthcoming from central government?
So I think it's a really good question, and I think the work that we want to take place over the next couple of months is also very much going to be looking at the funding options. So I don't think we want to rule anything out. I mean, I picked up, if that is a government priority, then what we've got to do is we've got to do that lobbying both as officers and as members about kind of accessing that funding. There isn't anything awfully forthcoming at the moment, but I think it's a case of watch your space. But I think there are lots of different sources that we will have to look at and tap into, and I think some of that work that we want to do over the next couple of months is to look at what the potential is now versus what might be coming upstream. And the business plan is a 30-year plan, so we always focus on the next 5 to 7 years, but we've also got to have a bit of an eye on the next 30 years as well. And I think certainly the greener agenda and carbon neutrality is going to be much longer than 5 to 7 years, so we do have to have that outlook. But hopefully some of that will be able to flesh out in the revised business plan that comes forward later in the year. I think there's just a bit of external expertise that we need to kind of bring to the table to be able to feed into that.
I'm very encouraged to hear that you've employed somebody to look specifically at that, and look forward to the reporting back on over the next couple of months. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
So can I ask if there were any other members of the committee who'd like to ask a question of Councillor Taylor-Smith?
Yes, may I?
Yes, Councillor Ali.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kim and Tyron and everyone else who contributed to the budget. I know it's been a long evening already. The question that I wanted to ask has already been asked by Councillor Greg Hammond, but just want to know if there are any other properties that we may have out of the borough that we may need to know, rather than just the garage that has been mentioned. So Tyron, when you're working on this, or Kim, could you please include all other properties, not just the one that has been mentioned by Councillor Greg Hammond, and if you can include that to the whole whole committee rather than just the individual who asked the question, I would appreciate.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll take that away, and we'll make sure that that's just not just the garages. We'll look at the portfolio.
Thank you very much. And Kim, good to see you doing well as well.
Thank you, Kasim.
So do we have any other questions from the committee or other councillors? Councillor Evans.
I had a quick question. I was wondering if in the property portfolio, with the retail units, are most of them essential sales, or do you have other retail units?
It's a real mixed bag. I think if I was generalizing them, under the estates, typically in the basements, we have sublet car parks and storage, which seem to be quite popular. And those are in the main, as I say, where we're actually related to estates. And then where we obviously have a lot of retail under our homes, they tend to be very small. The largest one is the Stella McCartney, who's no longer in occupation property, which is on the Fulham Road, Brompton Road. That's quite a large retail unit that we have, probably one of our largest and most valuable ones, single one. Typically, though, most of our retail units are quite small, and so a very varied amount of place. We have some people who've been trading very well, who are in food retailing, but equally we've got a good few people who are in hospitality restaurants who have been suffering very badly. But in the main, they're small shops.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
And just to add to that, kind of that's within the context of the HRA, but I think there's a much wider issue, Kim, isn't there, in terms of the general fund?
The general fund.
It's a similar sort of issue that's impacting on, the wider portfolio of property that we've got and retail. So yeah, I think it's twofold, isn't it? It's the direct commercial portfolio that's impacting directly on the HRA, but much wider. It's across the board.
Thank you.
Yeah. Chair, can I just come back to one more question to Akim, please?
Yes, Councillor Ali.
Thank you. Kim, we know this coronavirus had a huge effect on not just our residents, but also businesses and people who have been renting from us, from the council, for a long time. Do you see that in the near future, as soon as we hopefully come out of this virus, that many long-term tenants may lose their tenancy because of the difficulties they have gone through, and if nothing else, the depression, the stress, and we both know, having just recovering from COVID-19, how stressful it is. If nothing else, would you see that? And if that's the case, do you have a policy in mind to support them in the long term so that they can retain their policies and hopefully their tenancies and come back out of this problem that the whole country is going through?
Yeah, a short answer, Kasim, is yes, we do have a range of support. And I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's very much our intention to support our our retailers, our tenants who've been with us a long time, and it's only right that we do that. So we have been given rent concessions. We haven't written off all the rent. We've actually deferred it, because there's some people, if they've been trading well and they have the ability to pay, it's important that they do pay. But what we're doing is we're talking to people about spreading the rent, or we're having those discussions. But the important thing is that we're doing that on a case-by-case basis. We don't have a blanket one-size-fits-all basis. It's all down to a conversation with the individuals. But as I say, the important thing for us is to retain our tenants and not lose them, because it's difficult to find good tenants.
Have we lost them any so far? Or if so, can you give us a...
Yes, I mean, I mentioned Stella McCartney. She's closed her shop and handed back the lease. I mean, and that is a large tenant. The property's now being remarketed again. Yes, we are losing tenants. People are packing up and giving up. But that's not for us chasing them for the rent. That's because their business model is suffering. Yeah.
Thank you.
Marwan, you wish to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Taryn. Thanks, Kim, for this very interesting budget in terms of very difficult circumstances. COVID is having a big impact on us to plan and on our tenants, on our residents. And if I just thank Kim for, again, he reinforcing that's the formula, giving the concessions to keep tenants through thick and thin. It's really welcomed because we need to sustain our businesses for employability, for skills, for long term. So I welcome that. But I would like to see what formula is being used in order to. I know you are addressing each case separately, but is there any concession formula or mix? So in terms to show fairness in addressing these businesses. I know you are maybe one of the characteristics is long-term standing tenants. Maybe you are giving them higher priority. So it's just to show what formula is being applied in order to do a fair concession system in place. And the other one, just a clarification from the point 7.13 regarding the long-term funding beyond 2021-22 for adult social care, which remains uncertain. So I would just like some clarification on that point, Madam Chair, and thank you.
Who's going to, Karen, are you going to answer that? Yeah.
Yeah, Kim, shall I? And if I comment on the formula, I think.
Okay, no, you comment on the formula. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably Kim summarised it. There isn't one set formula. I think the work that's taken place by the team is looking at each business on a case-by-case basis, and I think some may not have been impacted at all. So by applying a formula, would almost remove that case-by-case basis. So I would say there's a whole range of factors that would need to be considered about supporting the business in the right way. Some of that will be flexible payment options, but there isn't. I would say there isn't one set formula. So each business will be treated slightly differently, and depending on the sector that they're in. So like I say, there are some that won't have been impacted at all versus some that will be very heavily impacted. In terms of adult social care, I think the uncertainty about funding. So there's a number of funding streams that's in place at the moment, which we haven't yet got guarantee of beyond 21-22. One is a social care grant. It's about 5.7 million. It's not just limited to adults. It can be used for both adults and children. We got confirmation for 21-22, but we don't know whether that will continue to 22-23. Obviously, it says in the paper the ability for local authorities to introduce the precept to fund adult social care pressures. Again, we know it's an option for 21-22, but we don't know if that will continue. So there's a couple of things that within our financial planning beyond next year, we just aren't able to factor in at the moment. We've got to have a working assumption that they won't continue. We have heard a lot over the last couple of years about talk about a green paper for adult social care funding. So that's about making adult social care more sustainable rather than relying on these kind of one-off grants that we're kind of hoping that just continue into the future. It's gone very quiet. I think there's probably lots of other priorities by government. So I think there's a combination of different things that makes from 22-23 quite uncertain. And also on the other side, the impact of COVID on adult social care. We don't know, what the long-term impacts will be of COVID going into both next year, 21-22, but also longer term as well. So I would say there's a lot of uncertainty, but not just within adults. I think it's probably across a lot of our budgets, but we've got some good approaches in place. We are constantly looking at what the outlook is.
It might be worth adding as well that, of course, the government acknowledges all of that in the way that they have allowed, or potentially allowed this year, of 3% additional levy for adult social care rather than the usual 2%. And certainly in setting our council tax, we'll be considering that very seriously because there is a shift. We can clearly see there's pressures.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Kim.
Okay,
thanks, Councillor.
So I think we'll move now, if you would like to stay with us, we'll move to the Budget Working Group's final paper. And I would ask Councillor Beryl Cox if he would like to introduce it.
Hello, I hope you can hear me through my microphone. I gather I'm very quiet.
No, we can hear you now, Adrian. It's fine.
I'm delighted to hear it. Firstly, I'd like to thank the officers for their support, without which we wouldn't have been in a position to come up with such a good report, and the lead members who have been very generous in giving us their time in coming and attending. I'd also like to thank the members of the committee who I thought made a very strong contribution. There are effectively 4 recommendations coming out of the meetings which we've had, which are reflected in the final report to this group. There at paragraph 1.2. The first is to deal with the 3 major savings coming out of which are going to effectively seek to balance the budget next year. Those being waste and street cleaning contract, temporary accommodation, and the transitions programme, which was one to which we paid particular attention. The second is to see what can be done about increased consultation with residents. That's not to say that officers haven't made best efforts, but nonetheless the results are not as one would perhaps wish them to be. Thirdly, we hope to start rather earlier next year. Now, that was our intention this year, and we failed really to meet that, principally for 2 reasons. COVID has basically thrown any aspect of predictability of the budget into confusion, and has meant that product which we could scrutinise was late through and is still somewhat uncertain. And secondly, the agreement with central government as to the funding programme has also been uncertain. And the last is really seeking to get ourselves more embedded next year, possibly with more product by way of quarterly finance and performance reports to look at during the year, as opposed to the thing being a rush at the end of the year every time. Beyond that, I don't really have a great deal to add.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you, Adrian, for being the chairman of this group. I think I found it, this year as last year, I found it very helpful, very valuable, and I would like to thank the lead members and the officers who actually came and gave us, very comprehensive briefings. And I think it's a good piece of work. I don't know if anyone has any other comments to say, either members of the committee or other members, of the working group or members of the committee. Okay. Stunned silence. Okay, so I'm going to ask someone. Councillor Lindsay, are you there? Perhaps you'd like to say something about being on the working group.
I am here, Councillor Rossi.
I thought you were, yes.
Hiding behind my screen. No. I think all I'd say is that there are 4 recommendations, which is a manageable amount. It was a worthwhile project. We need to continue doing it. Clearly, the council's finances are going to need a BDI being kept on them indefinitely. I think that was always the case. It's clearly the case now, more than ever. Quite what the medium and longer term implications are for what local government might look like, and the implications of that, and the degree to which this may be, which COVID may be a catalyst for significant change, is clearly unknowable. But I don't think we should be, we should ignore that possibility that there might be really significant changes.
Thank you. So, Councillor Pascal.
Thank you, Chair. The question I wanted to ask was, do we feel in the Working Party that taking up on what David Lindsay just raised, a question of change, Barry quite rightly said in an earlier part of this meeting that there are some fairly substantial changes in what's available now in terms of IT support for processes. and he began to hint, I think, at the potential for fairly radical transformational change within the borough's working to reduce costs in a whole number of areas. The question I'm asking is, does the budget working group feel that sufficient investment is being made in looking at that potential for change, not just in terms of IT within the council, but in terms of the internet provision within the borough?
Yeah, thank you, Will. I'm not sure that Councillor Mason is still with us, but this is an issue he has raised about spending on the IT budget. And I know that's something that I think we've agreed we're going to look into. Perhaps Mary would say something, or Taryn, about that.
Yes, I mean, I've said I welcome it. I mean, I think the IT budget is always a difficult one because quite a lot of what we see goes on under the surface. So, I mean, you'll have seen that one of the budget pressures was spending more on security after the Hackney hack. And all of that work, which is fairly expensive and resource consuming, is very boring and but really absolutely vital. So I think, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at what we spend and how we spend it. So I would really welcome that kind of scrutiny. I think it'd be very helpful.
Okay, I'm going to call on Max Chowan. Are you still here, Max? To perhaps say something about the group, and then I'm going to ask everyone who's been on the working group who's in the room. So if you're there, Max.
I am indeed, yes. Well, I was just looking at the future budget scrutiny, and I think I'm in agreement with what we agreed in the previous meeting, that we should continue the working group on the good work that's been done. And all the comments on the processes that we made in early 2020. I guess this is what you're looking for, is kind of validation that we should continue this. Is that correct, Chair?
To interrupt, I think we're probably looking for as much as anybody wants to give, and I think that building on the earlier point, I don't think we did scrutinise the IS budget as much as we would hope to, and I think that certainly from my point of view, I'm going to take recommendations as to future conduct of the group as being precisely rather than that, as being that, rather than being defensive about criticisms, and that is something I think we can work on next year.
So I'm just going to ask now from feedback from Walla or Linda, if you're still in the room, if you would like to say something.
Yes, I thought that the Working Party was interesting. I think that we needed more time. I think that there's a lot to digest, especially as it's a time of change. We don't quite know how things are going to pan out and how it's going to impact, especially on housing and adult social care. When we first started this, adult social care wasn't considered until we called it in. And it was fortuitous because, in fact, the pandemic came after we just literally called it in. I think we're going to find that, one, we've got more hidden people who become revealed as a result of the pandemic, and how that impacts on adult social care and how we actually use the budget and to meet those needs. And also, I think that how the fallout from housing and whether Kim gets all the money he needs to be able to build out new and actually recoup the rents. So I think that it's we do need more time, because it almost felt in some cases that some areas that really did need more scrutiny just were concertinaed.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And as Adrian said, it was our intention to start earlier, and it didn't happen. But this year. I hope it does. But I would like to thank Taryn and Mary in particular again, because I found it myself a very useful process. So, committee, the time is now 10:15. Are we in agreement that we postpone the rest of the meeting to another time, or convene another meeting? Or, sorry, Councillor Ali wishes to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I think what the committee decides from now onwards, we'll be happy to follow that, whether we continue or we finish that at the next meeting. But in terms of the working group, the budget working group, I have attended one, of course, the Chairman Adrian has chaired, and I truly enjoyed it. So I was thinking maybe, as you said, with the more time, that committee would help. And if there is any future opportunity, I'll make myself available to, if there are posts for that committee, so that I can join and hopefully look into not just the community side of it, but also from the housing side of it. So if the team will happy to have me, I will be happy to join the working group.
Right, it's up to Adrian. I'd say great.
I'm sure you'll be very welcome indeed.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Evans has now raised her hand.
Yes, sorry to lengthen the meeting. This is only, it'll take a minute. I think the investment in IT is really important. We've made tremendous strides since I joined the council in 2018. We've moved on light years. We were able to get all of the people online in Zoom rooms, team rooms, all kinds of meetings. The security may need improving, but I won't go into that right now. But I think it's a very important investment and taking the council forward. And also we have to look at some of the investments to make sure that they're not defunct in 6 months' time. We have to take a long-range approach to that, but I do support the funding of IT.
And I just say thank you very much for those kind words, because I think we can all be very proud of the way that officers had prepared us for moving off without, we were just prepared. We were on Windows 10. They'd done all that groundwork, which made us, unlike lots of other organisations, be able to move to working offline. And I certainly am very grateful for all the forethought that went into that.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Walla, did you wish to say something?
I was going to, but I think everybody covered every ground. I was going to thank the officers actually for all the work they did and for getting us to where we are now. But Mary beat me to it, so yeah, I'll keep it short. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll say yes. It's been a long meeting, but we had some very important things to discuss. So I thank you all for participating. I will arrange to have a meeting between the chairs where perhaps we can go through the work programme and the KDs, and I will see you all tomorrow night, I guess. Okay, thank you, and thank you,
Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Good night.
Stay safe.